Before we begin tonight's journey into one of America's most enigmatic institutions, I want to ask for your support in a few quick ways. If you're enjoying this content, using your hype points on this video helps the channel more than you could possibly know. It truly makes a difference in reaching more people who love these deep dives into history's mysteries. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review helps us out tremendously. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing our global community and discovering when and where everyone listens to these stories. Finally, if you enjoy this type of content, subscribing helps us continue bringing you these documentaries week after week. Thank you so much for being here, and a special thank you to Stake Joan, Todd Rockwell and Steve Howe for suggesting tonight's topic. This is one we've been excited to explore. Now let's begin. There are buildings on college campuses across America where students walk past every single day without giving them a second thought. Old stone structures with historical plaques, memorial halls named after forgotten benefactors, libraries that smell like old books and floor polish. But at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, there stands a building that students don't just walk past casually, they look at it differently. Some stare. Some take pictures from across the street. Some whisper about what might happen inside. It has no windows facing the street. The doors are always locked. No tours are offered. No public events are held there. The building is called the Tomb, and it belongs to an organisation that has existed for nearly 200 years, producing presidents, senators, Supreme Court justices, intelligence directors, and corporate executives in numbers that statistics alone cannot easily explain. The organisation is called Skull and Bones. Tonight, we're going to examine a conspiracy theory that asks a simple but unsettling question. What if the people who shape America's future are identified and prepared for power long before the public ever knows their names? What if leadership isn't earned through public competition, but selected through private ritual? What if democracy begins not in voting booths or debate halls, but in secret meetings where oaths are sworn and lifelong loyalties are forged? This is the story of Skull and Bones, the society that conspiracy theorists believe picks the winners early. The theory we're exploring tonight doesn't claim that Skull and Bones controls every aspect of American government. It makes a more subtle and perhaps more disturbing claim that parallel to the democratic processes Americans trust, there exists another system of selection and advancement, one that operates in shadows and secrecy, one that identifies future leaders when they're still young and malleable, one that binds them together through ritual and oath in ways that transcend political ideology or public accountability. For nearly 2 centuries, this organisation has quietly shaped American power. It has done so without manifestos, without public campaigns, without ever explaining itself to the citizens whose lives its members influence. It exists in a space between legitimacy and conspiracy, too established to be dismissed as fringe cultism, too secretive to be accepted as ordinary networking. What you're about to hear is the documented history of Skull and Bones, combined with the conspiracy theories that history has generated. Some of what follows is verified fact, some is informed speculation, some exists in that uncertain territory where evidence is suggestive but not conclusive, where patterns emerge but causation remains unclear. By the end of tonight's story, you'll understand why Skull and Bones has fascinated conspiracy theorists for generations. You'll see the evidence they find compelling, you'll understand the counter-arguments, and you'll be left with the same question that has haunted researchers for decades. In a democratic society, who really chooses the people who lead us? Chapter 1. The Birth of an American Secret Society. The year's 1832. Andrew Jackson is president, waging war against the Second Bank of the United States, and presenting himself as a champion of common people against elite financial interests. The Industrial Revolution is transforming the American economy, creating new fortunes and new forms of power. Yale University, already over a century old, is training the sons of America's emerging elite. Into this world steps William Huntington Russell, a student who would change the landscape of American power in ways that wouldn't become fully apparent for generations. Russell came from privilege. His family had wealth and connections. But what set him apart was his exposure to something most American students never encountered: the secret societies of Europe. Russell had spent time studying in Germany, where he witnessed how young men of privilege formed bonds that lasted lifetimes, where influence was cultivated in private and exercised in public, where membership meant access to networks that operated beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. The German student societies, Russell observed, weren't simply social clubs. They were institutions where future leaders formed alliances before they had any official power, where loyalty was tested through ritual and oath, where the boundaries between friendship and political alliance dissolved entirely. These societies had existed for centuries, surviving wars and revolutions, adapting to changing times while maintaining their essential character. Russell returned to Yale inspired and ambitious. He wanted to create something similar in America, something exclusive, something permanent, something that would endure long after he and his classmates had graduated and moved into positions of influence. But Russell understood that simply copying European models wouldn't work. America was different. It prided itself on democratic values and equality of opportunity. A secret society would need to operate more carefully here, maintaining influence while avoiding the kind of attention that might threaten its existence. Russell found a partner in Alphonso Taft, a fellow student whose family would become synonymous with American power. Taft's son would later become President William Howard Taft, continuing a pattern that would repeat across generations, Skull and Bones membership passing from father to son, creating dynasties of influence that spanned centuries. Together, Russell and Taft established what would officially be called the Order of Skull and Bones. The name was provocative, even disturbing. Why choose symbols of death for an organization supposedly dedicated to leadership and achievement? Conspiracy theorists have long debated this question. Some suggest it reflects philosophical beliefs about transformation and rebirth. Others propose darker interpretations involving power over life and death. From the very beginning, the society was built on three foundational principles that would never change: secrecy, loyalty, and highly selective membership. The secrecy was absolute. Members were forbidden from discussing what happened within the society, not just with outsiders, but often even with family members. This wasn't casual discretion. It was enforced omerta, backed by ritual oaths and social pressure that made breaking silence virtually unthinkable. The loyalty was permanent. Once initiated, a member remained a bonesman for life. The bonds formed during the undergraduate years were expected to endure through careers, political disagreements, even personal conflicts. The society came first, before party, before ideology, before almost any other allegiance. The selectivity was ruthless. Only 15 new members each year, chosen from Yale's entire student body. No applications accepted, no campaigning allowed. Students were simply selected, tapped on the shoulder, and invited to join an organization they knew existed but understood almost nothing about. This combination of secrecy, loyalty, and selectivity created something unprecedented in American institutional life. It wasn't a political party because it included members from all parties. It wasn't a business network because it operated across all industries. It wasn't a religious order because it required no particular faith. It was something else entirely, something that didn't fit into conventional categories, and that ambiguity would protect it for nearly 2 centuries. The society established itself in a meeting space that students began calling the Tomb. The original structure was modest, but as the organization's wealth grew through alumni donations, the Tomb was rebuilt multiple times, each iteration more imposing than the last. By the 20th century, it had become the windowless stone fortress that still stands today. From the street, it looks like a mausoleum. That impression, conspiracy theorists suggest, is entirely intentional. The architecture makes a statement. The building has no windows facing the street, suggesting that what happens inside is none of the public's business. The doors remain locked except during specific times when members gather. There are no signs identifying the building or explaining its purpose. It simply exists, imposing and silent, a physical manifestation of power that need not justify itself. But what happens inside the tomb has never been publicly documented. No journalist has ever been invited in. No documentary crew has ever filmed there. No member has ever published a detailed account of the rituals, though many have hinted at their intensity. This informational void creates space for speculation, and speculation about skull and bones has flourished for generations. Some accounts suggest the interior is decorated like a Victorian secret society, with skulls and bones adorning the walls, with artifacts collected from around the world, with stolen items that should rightfully be in museums or returned to their countries of origin. Other accounts describe rooms dedicated to specific purposes, debate chambers where members argue politics and philosophy, dining halls where lifelong friendships are forged over shared meals, ritual spaces where initiations take place. The truth is that very few people outside the society know for certain what the tomb contains or what happens there. This is where the conspiracy theory begins to take root, when an organisation that produces extraordinary numbers of powerful people operates entirely in secret, when it refuses to explain itself or justify its practices, when it maintains absolute discretion for nearly 2 centuries, questions naturally arise. Are the rituals merely theatrical traditions, college theatrics that happen to involve successful people? Or are they designed to create psychological bonds that transcend normal friendship? Is Skull and Bones simply a prestigious college club? Or is it something more calculated, a mechanism for identifying and preparing future leaders before the public has any say in the matter? The Society's founders left behind very little explanation of their intentions. What they did leave behind was an organisation that would quietly endure for nearly 2 centuries, never seeking publicity, never defending itself against accusations, never explaining its purpose to outsiders, never reforming its practices in response to criticism or changing social norms. Consider what this means. Skull and Bones was founded before the Civil War, before women could vote, before the abolition of slavery, before most of the institutions of modern America existed, yet it has survived all those changes without fundamentally altering its structure or practices. It still selects 15 members per year. It still operates in absolute secrecy. It still binds members through ritual and oath. This continuity across nearly 2 centuries suggests either remarkable irrelevance, meaning society has changed but Skull and Bones hasn't mattered enough to require change, or remarkable resilience, meaning the society has maintained its essential functions while adapting enough to survive in changing circumstances. Conspiracy theorists believe the latter. They argue that Skull and Bones has endured because it serves a function that remains valuable, regardless of social change, identifying young people with leadership potential and binding them into networks that facilitate the accumulation and exercise of power. The society began with 15 members in 1832. By 1840, it had initiated over 100 members who were beginning to enter professional life. By 1860, several hundred bonesmen were distributed across law, finance, education and government. By the 20th century, thousands of living and deceased members formed a network that touched virtually every institution of American power. And all of it happened behind locked doors, through selection processes the public never witnessed, through rituals the public never understood, in service of purposes the society never felt obligated to explain. Silence, as conspiracy theorists often point out, can be its own form of power. When you never have to justify yourself, when you never have to explain your practices or defend your influence, when you simply exist and continue existing regardless of criticism or scrutiny, you occupy a position of power that accountability could only weaken. Skull and Bones mastered this form of power from the beginning. It never argued for its right to exist. It simply existed. It never claimed to be important. It simply produced important people. It never sought legitimacy. It achieved something more valuable, inevitability. By the time most Americans became aware that Skull and Bones existed, it had already been operating for over a century, had already produced multiple generations of leaders, had already embedded itself so deeply in American institutional life that dislodging it would require dismantling Yale itself. This is the foundation of the conspiracy theory we're exploring tonight. Not that Skull and Bones appeared suddenly with sinister intentions, but that it established itself gradually, building power incrementally, creating networks that strengthened with each generation until it became part of the infrastructure of American elite life, invisible to most citizens but influential in ways that shaped their lives nonetheless. Chapter 2: The Selection Process. Every spring at Yale, something unusual happens. 15 students receive an invitation that will change their lives. They are told they have been selected for membership in Skull and Bones. The moment of selection is called Tap Night, and it carries weight that extends far beyond a simple invitation to join a college organisation. Only 15, every single year. No more, no less. This number has remained constant for nearly 2 centuries, through world wars, social movements, and dramatic changes in American education. Yale's student body has grown substantially since 1832, but Skull and Bones has never increased its annual intake. This artificial scarcity is deliberate and essential to the society's model. The selection process is not public. Students do not apply. They do not campaign for membership. They do not interview or submit resumes. They are simply chosen, and the criteria for that choice has never been officially disclosed. The society offers no explanation of what it looks for or why particular students are selected over others who might seem equally qualified. But patterns emerge when you study the membership lists that have been partially reconstructed by researchers over the decades. Certain families appear again and again across generations. The Tafts, the Bushes, the Harrimans, the Whitneys, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts. Sons follow fathers into the society. Sometimes brothers are tapped in different years. Occasionally members marry each other, and their children later become members themselves. This dynastic pattern is not universal. Skull and Bones does tap students without family connections to previous members, but the frequency of legacy membership far exceeds what random selection would produce. This suggests that family connection is not merely one factor among many, but a significant consideration in the selection process. Why would an organisation supposedly dedicated to identifying leadership talent place such emphasis on family lineage? Conspiracy theorists offer several explanations. First, family membership creates continuity across generations. When a father introduces his son to other bonesmen, institutional knowledge transfers directly. The younger member learns not just the rituals and traditions, but the unwritten rules about how the network functions, who holds influence, and how favours are exchanged. Second, family membership intensifies loyalty. When multiple generations of a family belong to Skull and Bones, the organisation becomes part of family identity. Leaving the society or betraying its confidences would mean breaking not just with an organisation but with family tradition and expectation. Third, family membership concentrates power. When the same families produce leaders generation after generation, they accumulate institutional knowledge and connections that newcomers cannot easily replicate. They understand how power works because they've watched it work their entire lives. They know who to call because their parents knew who to call. They navigate elite institutions effortlessly because those institutions are their native environment. This is not unusual for elite institutions. Legacy admissions exist throughout higher education. Networking among wealthy families is expected in business and politics. But Skull and Bones takes this pattern and intensifies it through absolute selectivity. 15 people per year, chosen from a student body of thousands, creates a bottleneck of access so narrow that getting through it becomes a mark of destiny rather than achievement. The conspiracy theory suggests that this selection process serves a specific function beyond networking or tradition. It identifies individuals not for what they have already accomplished, but for what they are likely to accomplish in the future. It looks for leadership potential, family connections, psychological resilience, discretion, and most importantly, the ability to operate effectively within elite networks. Consider what this means for understanding American leadership. The public narrative suggests that leaders emerge through competition and merit. The most capable people rise to positions of authority because they demonstrate superior ability in public contests. But if Skull and Bones functions as conspiracy theorists suggest, then many leaders are identified decades before the public knows their names. selected at age 20 based on criteria that have nothing to do with public accountability or democratic values. The mathematics reinforce this concern. 15 new members per year over nearly 2 centuries creates a network of several thousand living and deceased bonesmen at any given time. That network spans generations but remains small enough to maintain cohesion. Everyone knows everyone, or knows someone who knows everyone. Information flows quickly. Opportunities are shared. Doors open quietly without public announcement or competitive application processes. When a young bonesman enters the professional world, whether in law, finance, politics, intelligence, or media, there is always someone already in that world who can make an introduction, offer advice, or provide an opportunity that might not be advertised publicly. This is how elite networks have always functioned. But Skull and Bones has refined this process through nearly 2 centuries of practice. The selection criteria, though never officially disclosed, can be partially inferred from membership patterns. The society favours students who are intelligent, but not necessarily the most brilliant, ambitious but not overtly aggressive, socially skilled but discreet. It values conformity to elite norms more than radical originality. It looks for people who can work within systems rather than against them, who understand that influence often works better through quiet persuasion than public confrontation. Some researchers have suggested that members are selected not randomly, or even based purely on merit, but according to a longer-term vision of maintaining the society's influence across different sectors of American power. If this is true, then the society might deliberately choose members who seem likely to enter different professions, ensuring that future networks span law, finance, media, government, and intelligence. This would explain why Skull and Bones members appear in such diverse fields. It's not that the society pushes members toward particular careers, but that it deliberately selects a mix of people likely to pursue different paths, creating a distributed network more resilient than any hierarchical organisation could be. The selection process also serves a psychological function. Being chosen for Skull and Bones at age 20 sends a powerful message to the selected student. You're special, you're destined for leadership, you belong to something larger than yourself. This message, delivered at a formative age, can shape identity and ambition for life. Young people are particularly susceptible to this kind of validation. At 20, most students are still forming their sense of self, still uncertain about their place in the world, still hungry for recognition and belonging. Being selected by an organisation with Skull and Bones mystique and history provides all three. It tells the student that they have been recognised as exceptional by people who matter, that they belong to an elite group with nearly 2 centuries of history, and that their future likely includes positions of influence and power. This psychological impact cannot be overstated. When someone believes they are destined for leadership from age 20, they behave differently. They take risks they might otherwise avoid. They pursue opportunities they might otherwise consider out of reach. They develop confidence that comes from knowing they have a network supporting their ambitions. The selection process also creates obligation. Students selected for Skull and Bones understand, even if it's never explicitly stated, that they are expected to achieve something significant with their lives. The society has invested in them, granted them access to networks and resources that most people never receive. That investment creates pressure to succeed, to validate the society's choice, to become the kind of leader the society believed they could be. This pressure can be motivating or burdensome, depending on the individual, but it's always present. Bonesmen who fail to achieve significant success in their careers carry not just personal disappointment, but the knowledge that they have failed to fulfill the expectations that came with selection. The society never confirms or denies these theories about its selection process. It simply continues selecting 15 students each spring, swearing them to secrecy, bonding them through ritual, connecting them to generations of previous members, and watching as they disperse into American institutional life. The result, conspiracy theorists argue, is a selection mechanism that operates entirely outside democratic accountability. The public has no input into who gets selected. There is no transparency about the criteria. There is no oversight of how the networks function once members leave Yale and enter positions of power. The entire system operates in shadow, producing leaders according to principles and priorities that the society never has to explain or justify. This is fundamentally different from other forms of elite networking. A student who attends Harvard or joins a prestigious law firm is participating in institutions that, while certainly elitist, at least operate according to known criteria and public purposes. You know what Harvard looks for in applicants. You understand what law firms value in associates. There is transparency, however limited, about how these systems function. Skull and Bones offers no such transparency. It exists outside the framework of accountability that governs most American institutions. It doesn't have to explain itself to Congress, to Yale administrators, to parents of students, or to the American public. It simply exists, selecting 15 people per year according to criteria known only to current members, perpetuating itself generation after generation. For conspiracy theorists, this opacity is not an unfortunate side effect of tradition. It is the point. The society's influence depends on operating outside public view, on maintaining selection processes that bypass democratic scrutiny, on creating networks that function according to loyalty and discretion rather than transparency and accountability. And for nearly 2 centuries this model has worked extraordinarily well. Chapter 3: Rituals and Psychological Bonding. What actually happens during Skull and Bones initiation rituals remains one of the most closely guarded secrets in American institutional life. Members are sworn to absolute secrecy. Violating that oath is considered one of the gravest betrayals possible within the organisation. The consequences of breaking silence are not legal, but social and professional, enforced through networks that span generations and reach into virtually every institution of American power. But over the decades, small details have leaked out. Some from disgruntled members who felt the society had failed them, some from students who witnessed activities near the tomb and drew conclusions about what must be happening inside, some from documents that were briefly made public before being sealed again, some from interviews where former members spoke in vague terms while trying to respect their oaths. These fragments, while incomplete and sometimes contradictory, paint a picture of rituals designed not for entertainment, but for psychological transformation. According to accounts that have surfaced over the years, initiates participate in ceremonies that involve theatrical representations of death and rebirth. They lie in coffins while other members stand around them, creating a vivid experience of mortality and vulnerability. This is not unique to Skull and Bones. Many secret societies and fraternal organisations use death symbolism in their rituals. But the intensity and seriousness with which Skull and Bones reportedly approaches these rituals sets it apart from typical college hazing or theatrical performance. The coffin experience allegedly serves multiple purposes. First, it creates a shared intense experience that bonds initiates to each other and to the members conducting the ritual. When people go through something unusual and psychologically significant together, they form connections that ordinary social interaction cannot replicate. Second, it reinforces the society's symbolism around death and transformation. The initiate enters the coffin as an ordinary student and emerges as a bonesman, metaphorically dying to their old identity and being reborn into the society. Third, it establishes psychological openness, placing yourself in a position of complete vulnerability before a group creates a mental state where you're more receptive to new identities and loyalties. Beyond the coffin ritual, accounts suggest that initiates confess their deepest secrets to the group. This practice, if true, serves crucial bonding and control functions. When you share information that could damage you if revealed, you create mutual vulnerability with the people who now possess that information. You cannot easily betray people who know things about you that you desperately want kept private. This mutual exposure creates insurance against future betrayal and binds members together in ways that ordinary friendship never could. The confession ritual also serves to test discretion. If an initiate's secrets later become public, the society knows someone has violated their oath, and the networks can respond accordingly. The threat of exposure works both ways. Members keep society secrets because the society keeps their secrets. This mutual assured discretion creates a system of loyalty enforcement that doesn't require written contracts or legal threats. Initiates are also reportedly given new names, symbolic identities that they will use within the society for the rest of their lives. This practice separates society identity from public identity. Within Skull and Bones, you're not the son of your father or the student with a particular major. You're your symbolic name, equal to other members in ways that outside status cannot affect. This creates a psychological space where hierarchies based on family wealth or social prominence matter less than loyalty to the group. The symbolic names also create a sense of timelessness and continuity. When a new member receives a name that was previously held by a member from decades earlier, they inherit a kind of spiritual lineage within the society. They become part of a tradition that extends backward to the founding and forward to future generations. This sense of continuity reinforces the message that Skull and Bones is not temporary but permanent, not a college club but a lifelong identity. Members swear oaths of loyalty that supersede other obligations. The exact wording of these oaths has never been publicly confirmed, but former members have suggested they involve promises never to reveal what happens within the tomb, never to betray fellow bonesmen, and always to offer assistance when called upon by another member. These are not casual promises. They are sworn during intense rituals designed to make the oath feel sacred and binding. The psychological effect of ritual oaths should not be underestimated. When someone makes a formal promise during a ceremony designed to feel significant and binding, that promise carries weight that ordinary commitments do not. The ritual context activates deep psychological responses connected to honour, identity, and belonging. Breaking such an oath feels like betraying not just other people, but yourself. The rituals reportedly take place in a room decorated with skulls, bones and artifacts collected by members over generations. Some accounts mention items that were allegedly stolen from other institutions or countries, relics that should be in museums but instead reside in the tomb, as trophies of the society's reach and irreverence toward conventional authority. One frequently mentioned item is a skull that supposedly belonged to the Apache leader Geronimo, allegedly stolen from his grave by Prescott Bush, father of George Herbert Walker Bush, during military service. The Bush family has denied this story, and there is no conclusive evidence the skull is authentic. But the persistence of such stories reveals something about how Skull and Bones is perceived. The society is seen as operating outside normal rules, taking what it wants, displaying items that should be returned or respectfully preserved, treating conventional morality as constraints that don't apply to people with sufficient power. Whether these accounts are accurate, exaggerated, or entirely fictional, the purpose they suggest is clear: creating bonds between members that go deeper than ordinary friendship. When people share intense experiences, confess vulnerabilities, participate in unusual rituals, and swear oaths together, they form psychological connections that can last decades. Conspiracy theorists argue that this is precisely the point. The rituals are not meaningless theatre inherited from 19th century secret societies. They are deliberate techniques for forging loyalty that transcends political disagreement, professional competition, or personal ambition. When two bonesmen meet later in life, even if they've never met before, they share something that creates instant trust, instant recognition, instant alliance. This kind of bonding is not unique to Skull and Bones. Military units use similar techniques, particularly special operations forces that need to create absolute trust among members. Religious orders use them, bonding initiates through ritual and vow in ways that create lifelong commitment. Intelligence agencies use them, recognizing that the most reliable assets are those who have been bonded psychologically rather than simply recruited transactionally. But those institutions serve public purposes that can be scrutinized and debated. Military units defend the nation. Religious orders serve spiritual communities. Intelligence agencies, however secretive, ultimately report to elected officials and are subject to at least theoretical oversight. Skull and Bones serves no public purpose at all. Its loyalty is to itself, and the question conspiracy theorists ask is, when members of this organization reach positions of significant power, where does their ultimate loyalty lie? The rituals also reportedly include discussions of power, history, and strategy. Members debate ideas freely within the tomb, exploring concepts that might be politically controversial in public settings. This intellectual freedom within a sealed environment allows for the kind of frank discussion that rarely happens in public life, where every word is recorded, scrutinised, and potentially weaponised by political opponents. If this is true, then Skull and Bones functions not just as a social network, but as a kind of private think tank, where future leaders test ideas and strategies long before they present them to the world. By the time a bonesman reaches public office, the thinking has already been refined in private, the alliances have already been formed, and the strategies have already been debated with people who understand power at a fundamental level. This creates an information asymmetry between insiders and outsiders. When a bonesman senator debates policy with a non-bonesman senator, they are not starting from the same position. The bonesman may have spent years discussing the issue with other members in the tomb, refining arguments, understanding counter-arguments, developing strategies. The non-member is starting fresh, without access to those years of private deliberation. The rituals serve one final crucial function. They create a filter for psychological resilience and conformity. Not every student selected for Skull and Bones completes initiation. Some reportedly decline the invitation, either because they find the society's secrecy troubling, or because they simply aren't interested. Others begin initiation but drop out when they experience the rituals and decide this isn't for them. The students who complete initiation are therefore self-selected for several qualities: willingness to participate in unusual rituals, ability to maintain absolute secrecy, conformity to group norms even when those norms seem strange, and commitment to lifelong membership in an organisation whose purposes are never fully explained. These qualities make for ideal members of any secret society, but they also make for ideal participants in elite power networks that operate outside public accountability. None of this proves conspiracy in the criminal sense. Creating intense bonding experiences through ritual is not illegal. Maintaining confidentiality among members of a private organisation is not illegal. Even swearing oaths of loyalty, as long as they don't involve illegal activity, is protected by freedom of association. But there is a difference between legal and transparent, between technically acceptable and compatible with democratic values. When future leaders are bonded through secret rituals that create loyalties transcending public accountability, when they form networks based on psychological manipulation and mutual vulnerability rather than shared public purpose, questions arise about whether such an organisation can coexist with genuine democracy, or whether it inevitably creates a shadow power structure that operates according to different rules. The rituals of Skull and Bones, whatever they actually involve, serve to answer a crucial question for the society. Are you one of us? Can you keep secrets? Can you participate in things that seem strange without asking too many questions? Can you maintain loyalty to the group even when it conflicts with other obligations? Can you exercise power quietly without needing public recognition or accountability? The students who answer yes to these questions, who complete initiation and embrace their new identity as bonesmen, become part of something that has been described as a cult, a secret society, an elite network, and a shadow government. The truth is probably all and none of these things. Skull and Bones is whatever its members make it, and what they have made, over nearly 2 centuries, is an organisation that produces leaders in numbers that seem to exceed coincidence. Chapter 4. The political pattern emerges. If you examine the history of American political leadership with Skull and Bones in mind, a pattern emerges that statistical analysis struggles to explain as pure coincidence. For an organisation that selects only 15 people per year from a single university, it has produced an extraordinary concentration of political power. Let's start with the presidency, the most visible and powerful position in American government. 3 members of Skull and Bones have been president or vice president, and several others have run serious campaigns for the office. Given that approximately 15,000 Americans have been bonesmen over the society's history, and only dozens of people have seriously competed for the presidency in that time, this represents a remarkable concentration. William Howard Taft was inducted into Skull and Bones in 1878. His father, Alphonso Taft, was one of the society's founders. William became the 27th President of the United States, serving from 1909 to 1913. After losing re-election, he was appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, making him the only person in American history to hold both offices. His presidency was relatively unremarkable, but his Supreme Court tenure was highly influential, shaping constitutional interpretation for years. The Taft family's involvement with Skull and Bones illustrates the dynastic pattern perfectly. Alfonso helped create the society. William continued the tradition. Other Taft family members followed. When one family helps establish an organisation and then continues producing leaders generation after generation, it suggests that power in that family is not simply individual achievement, but institutional inheritance. But the most striking example of Skull and Bones in the presidency comes from the Bush family. George Herbert Walker Bush was inducted in 1948. His father, Prescott Bush, had been inducted in 1917 and later served as a senator from Connecticut. George Herbert Walker Bush went on to serve in Congress as ambassador to the United Nations, as chairman of the Republican National Committee, as chief of the U.S. Liaison Office in China, as director of Central Intelligence, as vice president under Ronald Reagan, and finally as the 41st President of the United States from 1989 to 1993. Then George Walker Bush, son of George Herbert Walker Bush, was inducted in 1968, exactly one generation after his father. George Walker went on to serve as governor of Texas, and then as the 43rd President of the United States from 2001 to 2009. Think about what this means. A father and son, both members of the same secret society, both became President of the United States. This is the only time in American history that a father and son have both been president, with the exception of John Adams and John Quincy Adams in the early 19th century, before Skull and Bones existed in its current form. The probability of this happening by chance is extraordinarily low. There have been fewer than 50 presidents in American history. The fact that two of them were father and son, both belonging to an organisation that has had only about 15,000 members total, suggests either remarkable coincidence or systematic advantage conferred by society membership and the networks it provides. The Bush family's rise also illustrates how Skull and Bones networks might function across generations. Prescott Bush established connections during his time in the society. Those connections helped him in business and later in politics. When his son George Herbert Walker joined Skull and Bones, he inherited access to his father's networks while building his own. When George Walker Bush joined, he inherited 2 generations of connections, plus whatever advantages came from being the son and grandson of successful bonesmen. By the time George Walker Bush ran for president in 2000, he was not just another candidate. He was the son of a former president, the grandson of a senator, and a member of an organisation that had been grooming his family for leadership for 3 generations. His path to power was paved long before most Americans had heard his name, but the presidency is only the most visible manifestation of Skull and Bones' political influence. The society has also produced numerous senators, congressmen, governors, cabinet members, Supreme Court justices, and senior officials in every presidential administration for decades. Henry Stimson, inducted in 1888, served as Secretary of War under President Taft, Governor General of the Philippines, Secretary of State under President Hoover, and Secretary of War again under Presidents Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. His career spanned multiple decades and both political parties, illustrating how bonesmen maintain influence regardless of which party controls government. Stimson was particularly influential in shaping American policy during World War II and played a crucial role in the decision to use atomic weapons against Japan. Robert Lovett, inducted in 1918, served as Undersecretary of State, Deputy Secretary of Defense, and Secretary of Defense during the Truman administration. He was a key architect of Cold War policy and helped establish many of the institutions that would shape American foreign policy for decades. McGeorge Bundy, inducted in 1939, served as National Security Advisor to Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, playing a central role in escalating American involvement in Vietnam. His brother, William Bundy, also a bonesman, served in senior positions in the Defense and State Departments. The Bundy brothers illustrate another pattern. Siblings who are both bonesmen often both reach positions of significant influence, suggesting that society membership provides systematic advantages rather than simply recognising pre-existing talent. John Kerry, inducted in 1966, served as a senator from Massachusetts for nearly 3 decades, ran for president in 2004, and later became Secretary of State under President Obama. His career trajectory took him from anti-war activist in the 1970s to senior statesman in the 21st century, maintaining influence across dramatic changes in American politics. This list could continue for pages. Skull and Bones has produced politicians at every level of government in both parties across nearly 2 centuries. The concentration is particularly notable in positions related to foreign policy, intelligence and national security, areas where discretion is valued and networks of trust are essential. Conspiracy theorists ask, how does one student society at one university produce this many leaders? Is it simply that Yale attracts ambitious people, and Skull and Bones selects the most ambitious among them? Or is there something more systematic happening? A process of identification, cultivation and placement that operates largely outside public view? Critics of the conspiracy theory point out that correlation does not prove causation. Many Bonesmen never achieve significant political power. Many live ordinary professional lives as lawyers, business people, or academics. The successful ones, skeptics argue, would likely have succeeded anyway due to their intelligence, family connections, and work ethic. Skull and Bones might select successful people rather than creating them. This counter-argument has merit, but it doesn't fully explain the statistical concentration. If Skull and Bones were simply selecting people who would succeed anyway, you would expect society members to succeed at roughly the same rate as other elite Yale students with similar backgrounds. But the data suggests Bonesmen succeed at higher rates and reach more prominent positions, particularly in politics and intelligence. There is also the matter of bipartisan influence. Skull and Bones has produced leaders in both major political parties, suggesting that whatever advantage membership provides, it is not ideological. The society does not promote Republican or Democratic policies, it promotes its members. This bipartisan success is actually more suspicious to some conspiracy theorists than single-party dominance would be. It suggests an organisation that operates above politics, that maintains influence regardless of which party controls government, that views Republican versus Democrat as less important than insider versus outsider. Consider what this means for understanding American democracy. The public debates political issues, chooses between candidates, and believes it is participating in decision-making about the direction of the country. But if a significant number of the people competing for power all belong to the same secret society, all share bonds created through ritual and oath, all have access to the same networks of influence, then the range of genuine choice may be narrower than it appears. This doesn't mean elections are meaningless, or that policy differences don't matter, but it does suggest that certain assumptions about power and how it is distributed might be operating in the background, limiting what kinds of change are possible regardless of electoral outcomes. The political pattern of Skull and Bones also raises questions about meritocracy. American democracy is supposed to be based on the idea that anyone can rise to leadership through talent and effort. The reality has always been more complex, with family wealth and connections playing obvious roles, but Skull and Bones adds another layer, a selection mechanism that identifies future leaders at age 20, binds them through ritual and secrecy, and provides them with networks that function throughout their careers. If you're not selected at age 20, you're starting your career without those networks. You might be just as intelligent, just as ambitious, just as capable, but you'll spend your entire professional life competing against people who have advantages you cannot replicate. Lifelong connections to people in positions of power, instant trust based on shared ritual experience, and access to information and opportunities that flow through private networks rather than public channels. This is fundamentally incompatible with genuine meritocracy. It means that leadership in America is partially determined not by public competition, but by private selection that happens before most people even begin their careers. And that selection happens according to criteria the society never has to explain or justify. The political pattern of skull and bones suggests that American democracy, whatever its formal structures and procedures, functions in practice with a shadow system running parallel to it. Public elections happen, policy debates occur, voters make choices. But beneath all of that, networks of people who were selected at age 20, bonded through secret ritual, and granted access to centuries of accumulated connections, are quietly shaping outcomes in ways the public never sees. Chapter 5: The Election That Fueled Suspicion. The year 2004 presidential election should have represented a clear choice for American voters. The country was deeply divided after the disputed election of 2000, the September 11th attacks, and the decision to invade Iraq. The political atmosphere was intensely partisan. The stakes felt existential to both sides. The Republican candidate was George Walker Bush, the sitting president. He was defending his decision to invade Iraq based on claims about weapons of mass destruction that had proven false. He was promoting expanded executive power in the name of fighting terrorism. He was positioning himself as a wartime president, arguing that changing leadership during conflict would endanger national security. The Democratic candidate was John Forbes Kerry, a Massachusetts senator with nearly 3 decades of experience. Kerry had served in Vietnam and later become a prominent anti-war activist. He was criticizing the Iraq invasion as a strategic error. He was questioning the expansion of executive power and the erosion of civil liberties. He was presenting himself as someone who understood war's costs and would pursue different policies. The campaign was intense, personal, and often bitter. Debates about Iraq, terrorism, and American power dominated the discourse. Each side portrayed the other as dangerous, incompetent, or both. Millions of Americans watched, argued, and eventually voted, believing they were making a meaningful choice about their country's direction. But there was one fact that almost seemed like a footnote in the coverage, mentioned occasionally but never deeply explored. Both candidates were members of Skull and Bones. Bush had been initiated in 1968. Kerry had been initiated in 1966. They had walked through the same doors of the tomb. They had participated in the same rituals. They had sworn the same oaths. They had joined the same lifelong brotherhood. They shared something that connected them more deeply than political party, more permanently than policy disagreement, more intimately than most Americans share with anyone outside their immediate families. When reporters occasionally asked them about their shared membership, both candidates deflected in ways that only heightened suspicion. Bush, when asked about Skull and Bones during a television interview, smiled and said, "It's so secret I can't talk about it." Kerry, when questioned, said, "I wish there was something I could manifest to tell you I belong to it, but it's not a subject I can talk about." These responses are remarkable when you consider the context. Both men were asking to be trusted with the most powerful position on Earth. They were seeking authority over nuclear weapons, intelligence agencies, the military, and the machinery of American government. They were requesting the confidence of millions of voters who would entrust them with their safety, prosperity, and future. Yet on the question of their shared membership in a secret society that bound them together through oaths and ritual, both maintained absolute silence. They prioritized their oath to Skull and Bones over transparency to the American public. Whatever they had promised inside the tomb mattered more than what voters might reasonably want to know. For conspiracy theorists, this moment crystallized everything suspicious about Skull and Bones. Here were two men ostensibly competing for the presidency, presenting themselves as offering fundamentally different visions for America, yet they refused to discuss the one thing that united them more than anything divided them. The implications were disturbing. If Bush and Kerry both valued their Skull and Bones oath more than transparency to voters, what did that say about where their ultimate loyalty lay? If they had both sworn oaths within the tomb promising loyalty to fellow Bonesmen above other obligations, how would that affect their decision-making if they became president? Some conspiracy theorists went further, suggesting that the entire election was theatre. They argued that the American public was being offered a false choice, that Bush and Kerry represented different flavours of the same elite consensus, that whoever won would pursue policies serving the interests of the networks both men belonged to, rather than the voters who elected them. This theory is difficult to prove or disprove. Bush and Kerry genuinely disagreed on many policies. Their administrations would likely have pursued different courses on various issues, but the conspiracy theory doesn't claim that bonesmen always agree or coordinate on every decision. It claims something subtler, that they operate within a framework of shared assumptions that limits the range of possible change regardless of who wins elections. The 2004 election also highlighted another uncomfortable reality. American voters often face choices between candidates who all come from similar elite backgrounds. Bush and Kerry both attended Yale, both came from wealthy families, both had connections to power that stretched back generations. The fact that they also both belonged to the same secret society simply made explicit something that was usually implicit. Leadership in America draws from a remarkably small pool of people. The election was decided by a margin of about 3 million votes in a country of nearly 300 million people. Bush won. Kerry conceded gracefully, called for unity, and moved on with his career. The country continued forward. The Iraq War dragged on. The debates about terrorism and civil liberties continued. But for those already suspicious of elite power networks, the 2004 election became a lasting symbol. It represented the moment when the fiction of genuine choice became impossible to maintain. When both candidates belonged to the same secret society, maintained the same oath of silence, and refused to prioritise transparency to voters over loyalty to that society, democracy begins to look like a ritual as empty and theatrical as anything that happens inside the tomb. The mainstream media largely failed to treat this as a significant story. Some outlets mentioned the shared Skull and Bones membership as an interesting footnote or trivia. A few did segments on the society's history and influence. But there was no sustained investigation, no demands that the candidates explain themselves, no sense that this represented a fundamental problem for democratic legitimacy. Why the lack of serious coverage? Conspiracy theorists suggest several possibilities. First, many journalists covering politics are themselves graduates of elite universities and may have personal connections to people in these networks. They may not see anything unusual about it because it's normal in the world they inhabit. Second, the story is difficult to report without proof of wrongdoing. What exactly would the story be? 2 politicians belong to the same college organisation. That's not inherently scandalous without evidence of illegal coordination. Third, and most cynically, media organisations may depend on access to political power, and aggressively investigating the backgrounds of both major party candidates risks alienating the entire political establishment. Whatever the reason, the 2004 election passed with minimal serious examination of what it meant that both major candidates were bonesmen. The opportunity to have a national conversation about elite networks and democratic accountability was mostly missed. Kerry went on to serve as Secretary of State under President Obama, maintaining influence long after his presidential loss. Both he and Bush remained connected to the networks that had supported them throughout their careers. The Skull and Bones Brotherhood continued functioning as it always had, selecting 15 new members each spring, swearing them to secrecy, bonding them through ritual, and watching as some of them climbed toward power. The 2004 election is now receding into history, but it remains perhaps the clearest single illustration of the conspiracy theory at its core. When the 2 major party candidates for the most powerful office on earth both belong to the same secret society, and both refuse to discuss it, something is wrong with how we understand power in America. Either the society is meaningless, in which case why maintain such absolute secrecy, or it is meaningful, in which case why doesn't the public have a right to know how it influences people seeking our trust? Conspiracy theorists believe the answer is clear. The public doesn't have a right to know because true power operates outside the framework of democratic accountability. The election of 2004 made that truth visible for anyone willing to see it. Chapter 6: Intelligence and Power Corridors. If there is one institution in American government that embodies secrecy as a central principle, it is the intelligence community. The Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, military intelligence branches and other classified organisations operate largely beyond public scrutiny. Their budgets are secret. Their operations are classified. Their very existence often depends on the public not knowing what they do or how they do it. Given this reality, the overlap between Skull and Bones and American intelligence becomes particularly significant for conspiracy theorists. Here is an organisation that trains members in absolute secrecy and lifelong loyalty, producing graduates who then enter institutions that require those same qualities. The fit seems almost too perfect. George Herbert Walker. Bush's career trajectory offers perhaps the most compelling case study for understanding this relationship. Bush was initiated into Skull and Bones in 1948, joining a network that stretched back over a century. After Yale, he went into the oil business in Texas, achieving success but not extraordinary prominence. He entered politics, serving 2 terms in the House of Representatives. His career at that point was successful, but not particularly unusual for an ambitious politician from a wealthy family. Then his trajectory accelerated in ways that suggested someone pulling strings behind the scenes. He was appointed to a series of increasingly sensitive positions: ambassador to the United Nations, chairman of the Republican National Committee during the Watergate crisis, chief of the US Liaison Office in China at a crucial moment in Sino-American relations. Each of these appointments placed Bush at the centre of important networks and gave him experience in handling sensitive information and managing complex relationships. He was being prepared for something, though what wasn't yet clear. Then, in 1976, President Gerald Ford appointed Bush Director of Central Intelligence, making him the head of the CIA. This appointment raised eyebrows throughout the intelligence community and among conspiracy researchers. The CIA director position requires absolute trustworthiness, discretion, and the ability to manage secrets that could damage national security if revealed. It requires someone who understands loyalty, who can maintain relationships across party lines, who operates comfortably in environments where much remains unsaid. For critics of the intelligence establishment, the appointment of a Skull and Bones member to lead the CIA seemed like an almost perfect alignment of institutional secrecy. Bush came from an organisation that prized discretion and loyalty above all else. He was being placed in charge of an agency that operated by the same principles on a global scale. The CIA, founded in 1947, was relatively young when Bush took over. It was still establishing its culture and building its networks. Having someone with Bush's background, his understanding of how elite networks function, his connections throughout American institutional life, arguably made him ideal for the position. But conspiracy theorists see something more sinister in this appointment. They suggest that Skull and Bones has always functioned as an unofficial feeder network for intelligence agencies. The Society's emphasis on secrecy and loyalty makes its members ideal candidates for work that requires discretion. The lifelong bonds created through ritual mean that members can trust each other in ways that ordinary professional relationships cannot match. The network spanning generations means that intelligence work can be conducted through informal channels that leave no paper trail and require no official authorization. This theory cannot be definitively proven, but the patterns are suggestive. Multiple Bones men have worked in intelligence, diplomacy, and positions requiring security clearances. The overlap exceeds what random chance would predict. And the nature of intelligence work means that much of this history remains classified, making comprehensive analysis impossible. Consider how an intelligence network based on Skull and Bones connections might function. When a young Bonesman enters government service, there are always older members already in positions of authority who can vouch for his trustworthiness, facilitate his security clearance, and guide his career towards sensitive positions. When that member later needs to conduct off-the-books operations or communicate sensitive information, there are always other Bonesmen in various agencies and institutions who can help without requiring official channels that might later be discovered. This informal network operates parallel to official intelligence structures. It doesn't replace formal agencies but supplements them, providing channels for communication and coordination that leave no records and face no oversight. When members of Congress investigate intelligence failures or abuses, they examine official documents and interview agency personnel. They rarely think to investigate private networks that might be coordinating activities outside official channels. The intelligence connection also explains why Skull and Bones might be particularly sensitive about disclosure. Intelligence work depends on relationships and trust that would be damaged if widely known. When Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein exposed Deep Throat as Mark Felt decades after Watergate, it was controversial precisely because it revealed a trust relationship that had operated in secret. Imagine the damage if Skull and Bones membership lists and relationship networks were fully exposed, revealing connections between people who officially have no special relationship, but who actually share bonds created through ritual oath. After his time as CIA director, Bush became vice president under Ronald Reagan, then president himself. During his presidency, he oversaw the end of the Cold War, the Gulf War, and numerous covert operations that remained classified for years. His experience running the CIA presumably informed how he thought about intelligence, secrecy, and the use of power outside public view. To conspiracy theorists, Bush's career illustrates how power actually flows in America. It's not primarily about elections or public accountability. It's about being identified early, being initiated into networks of trust, and being moved through positions of increasing responsibility by people who already occupy those positions. Each step prepares you for the next step. Each position gives you experience, connections, and credibility that make the next appointment seem natural. By the time Bush ran for president in 1988, he had been ambassador to the UN, envoy to China, RNC chairman, CIA director, and vice president. His resume was impeccable, but conspiracy theorists note that this resume was built not through electoral success or public accountability, but through appointments made by presidents, confirmed by senators, facilitated by networks that operated largely outside public view. The fact that Bush's son, George Walker Bush, would later become president adds another layer to the theory. Two presidents from the same family, both Bonesmen, both having served in positions related to intelligence and national security, suggest that certain families and networks maintain influence across generations in ways that democratic accountability cannot easily affect. The Bush family's relationship with the intelligence community extends beyond George Herbert Walker. Prescott Bush, George Herbert Walker's father and fellow Bonesman, allegedly had his own intelligence connections dating back to World War II. Whether these connections were formal or informal, official or based on private networks, remains unclear because much of this history is either classified or simply not documented in ways that historians can access. This pattern of Bonesmen in intelligence positions continued after Bush. Porter Goss, inducted in 1960, served in the CIA for years before entering politics and eventually becoming CIA director under George Walker Bush. The appointment of one Bonesman president selecting another Bonesman to run the CIA struck conspiracy theorists as evidence that these networks continue functioning across generations, with members looking out for each other and ensuring that sensitive positions remain within trusted circles. The intelligence connection also raises troubling questions about accountability. Intelligence agencies are already among the least accountable institutions in American government. Their work happens in secret. Their failures often remain classified. Their successes cannot be publicly celebrated because doing so would reveal sources and methods. This lack of transparency creates opportunities for abuse that whistleblowers and oversight mechanisms only partially address. If intelligence work is also being conducted through informal networks based on secret society membership, accountability becomes even more difficult. How do you investigate operations that were never officially authorized? How do you trace decisions made through private conversations that left no records? How do you hold people accountable for coordination that happened through winks and nods between people who share ritual bonds? The answer is that you probably cannot. If Skull and Bones functions as conspiracy theorists suggest, it creates a parallel power structure that operates outside the already weak accountability mechanisms that exist for intelligence work. And because membership and activities remain secret, even proving that such coordination happens is nearly impossible. This is the essence of the conspiracy theory regarding Skull and Bones and intelligence. Not that the society directly controls the CIA or other agencies, but that it provides networks that facilitate informal coordination, enable off-the-books operations, and ensure that sensitive positions remain filled by people whose loyalty has been tested through ritual and oath. The society doesn't need to control intelligence agencies formally. It just needs to ensure that enough people in key positions share bonds that transcend official chains of command. Whether this theory is true cannot be definitively established. Intelligence work, by definition, leaves few traces. Secret societies by nature reveal little. The intersection of the two creates a realm where evidence is scarce and suspicion flourishes. What can be said is that the overlap between Skull and Bones and American intelligence exceeds coincidence, that members of the society have consistently held positions where secrecy and loyalty are paramount, and that the society's training in discretion and bonding creates ideal preparation for intelligence work that official training programs cannot replicate. For conspiracy theorists, this overlap is not accidental. It represents one of the primary functions Skull and Bones serves, identifying people who can be trusted with secrets, bonding them through ritual that creates loyalty deeper than law or procedure, and placing them throughout institutions where they can coordinate privately while appearing to work through official channels. If this theory is correct, then much of what Americans believe about how their government makes decisions is incomplete at best, dangerously naive at worst. The public debates policy. Congress passes laws. Presidents issue orders. But beneath it all, networks of people bonded through secret ritual decades earlier are quietly coordinating in ways that bypass democratic accountability entirely. The intelligence connection is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Skull and Bones conspiracy theory, because it involves secrecy upon secrecy, networks operating within agencies that already resist oversight, power being exercised in realms where the public has no access and little awareness. And all of it remains, like everything about Skull and Bones, locked behind doors that never open, protected by oaths that are never broken, continuing generation after generation, while the public debates the visible surface of power and rarely questions what operates beneath. Chapter 7. Above Politics. One of the most persistent and puzzling observations about Skull and Bones is that its members appear across the full spectrum of American politics. The society has produced committed Republicans and dedicated Democrats, conservative judges and liberal reformers, foreign policy hawks and diplomatic doves. This political diversity should theoretically undermine conspiracy theories about the society's coordinated influence. If Bones men fundamentally disagree about policy, how can they be working together behind the scenes? If they belong to different parties and advocate opposite positions, doesn't that prove the society is just a social network rather than a power conspiracy? But conspiracy theorists offer a different interpretation, one that is actually more sophisticated and disturbing than simple partisan coordination would be. They suggest that Skull and Bones operates at a level above conventional politics, that its influence functions regardless of which party controls government, that the society's real purpose is not advancing particular policies, but maintaining the power of a particular class of people. The theory goes like this. American politics offers the public a choice between options that have already been vetted and approved by elite networks. The differences between major party candidates are real, but exist within a narrow range of acceptable opinion. The really transformative ideas, the proposals that would genuinely redistribute power or challenge fundamental assumptions about how society should be organised, never get close to implementation because they're filtered out long before the public votes. Skull and Bones, in this view, is part of that filtering mechanism. It doesn't tell its members what specific policies to support. It doesn't coordinate legislative strategies or dictate platform positions. What it does is inculcate a shared worldview, a set of assumptions about who should hold power and how institutions should function, assumptions that transcend partisan disagreement. Consider the public political debates Americans witness. Republicans and Democrats argue about tax rates. They disagree on social policy. They offer competing visions of America's role in the world. These disagreements are genuine and the outcomes matter. But notice what they don't disagree about. The fundamental legitimacy of existing institutions, the basic framework of American capitalism, the essential structure of American foreign policy, the assumption that people like themselves should be making these decisions. Even when politicians present themselves as reformers or outsiders, they typically operate within boundaries that protect existing power structures. They may want to adjust how power is exercised, but they don't question whether they and people like them should hold that power in the first place. Skull and bones, conspiracy theorists argue, helps maintain these boundaries. Members may genuinely disagree about policy details, but they share deeper assumptions that limit the range of possible change. They believe in leadership by educated elites. They believe in institutional authority. They believe in gradual reform rather than revolutionary change. They believe that people who attended the right schools, know the right people, and understand how power actually works should be the ones making important decisions. These beliefs manifest in how Bonesmen interact across party lines. In public, they may criticize each other's positions fiercely, but in private, they maintain relationships that transcend political disagreement. They serve together on corporate boards and non-profit foundations. They attend each other's events. They provide each other with opportunities that have nothing to do with political affiliation. This pattern suggests a kind of professional courtesy among elites that ordinary citizens never experience. When political polarization leaves the public bitterly divided, unable to speak civilly across party lines, unable to find common ground on even basic questions, the elite networks continue functioning smoothly. Members understand that today's opponent might be tomorrow's ally, that maintaining relationships matters more than winning individual arguments, that they have more in common with each other than with the citizens they claim to represent. Skull and Bones institutionalizes this understanding. When members disagree about policy, they do so knowing they share something more fundamental. Membership in an organization that selected them at age 20, bonded them through ritual, and granted them access to networks that ordinary people never touch. That shared experience creates sympathy that survives political disagreement. The society never promotes itself as conservative or liberal. It doesn't issue position papers or endorse candidates. It simply continues selecting 15 people each year, binding them together through ritual and secrecy, and watching as they disperse into positions of power throughout American institutions, carrying with them assumptions and loyalties that shape their decision-making in ways the public never sees. To understand how this works in practice, consider the career of a hypothetical Bonesman politician. Let's call him James. James was selected for Skull and Bones as a Yale junior in the 1980s. He went through the rituals, formed bonds with his fellow initiates, and maintained connections with older and younger members after graduation. James enters politics as a Democrat. He's genuinely liberal on many issues. He supports environmental protection, social programs, and diplomatic solutions to international problems. He runs for office and wins, serving honourably and pushing for policies he believes in. But James is also operating within a framework shaped by his Skull and Bones background. When he needs campaign donations, some come from fellow Bonesmen, even those who are Republicans. When he needs political advice, he sometimes calls older members who have experience in government. When he's deciding whether to support a particular reform, he considers not just whether it's good policy, but whether it would damage relationships with people in his network. None of this requires conspiracy meetings or explicit coordination. It happens naturally through the networks that Skull and Bones created decades earlier. James doesn't think of himself as compromised. He's simply operating within his social and professional world, a world that happens to be populated heavily by people who share his elite background. Now imagine there's another Bonesman politician, Robert, who's a Republican. Robert and James disagree on almost everything. They belong to different parties, support opposite policies, and compete for power. But they also know each other from Yale, share connections to the same network, and understand that beneath their political disagreements, they have commonalities that transcend party. When James and Robert interact, something subtle happens. They disagree firmly but respectfully. They never question each other's fundamental right to hold power. They never suggest that the other should be excluded from leadership. They may want their own party to win, but they're comfortable with either of them being in charge because both are, at some fundamental level, their kind of people. This dynamic doesn't prevent James from being a genuine liberal, or Robert from being a genuine conservative. but it does mean that the range of political conflict between them exists within boundaries both accept. Neither will support policies that would truly threaten the power of people like themselves. Neither will ally with social movements that challenge elite authority. Neither will question whether people who went to Yale and belong to secret societies should be making decisions for everyone else. Multiply this pattern across hundreds of bonesmen in politics, law, finance, media, and intelligence, and you get a system that is genuinely competitive at the surface, but constrained at a deeper level. Real disagreements happen. Real consequences flow from elections, but certain fundamental arrangements remain protected regardless of outcomes. This is what conspiracy theorists mean when they say Skull and Bones operates above politics. It's not that members coordinate to impose specific policies, it's that they share assumptions that limit what kinds of change are possible. American politics offers meaningful choices within a range that has already been narrowed by networks most citizens don't know exist. The bipartisan nature of Skull and Bones influence also provides protection against exposure. When conspiracy theorists point out the society's role in shaping American power, defenders can respond by noting that members belong to both parties and advocate opposite policies. How can there be a conspiracy when Bonesmen disagree so fundamentally? But this misunderstands the nature of the conspiracy. It's not a conspiracy to make everyone agree. It's a conspiracy of access, ensuring that regardless of who wins elections, power remains in hands that have been vetted and approved through processes that bypass democratic accountability. The society's above politics positioning also explains its longevity. Organisations tied to specific ideologies or parties rarely survive major political realignments. When the environment changes, they become irrelevant. But Skull and Bones has no official ideology. It has survived the Civil War, the Progressive Era, the New Deal, the Civil Rights Movement, and every other major shift in American politics precisely because it adapts to serve its members regardless of political fashion. Whether members are promoting liberal or conservative policies, whether they're serving Democratic or Republican administrations, whether they're advocating isolation or intervention, they're all still Bonesmen, still connected through networks forged decades earlier, still operating according to assumptions about power and authority that transcend their public disagreements. For conspiracy theorists, this is more insidious than straightforward political coordination would be. Political conspiracies can be exposed and opposed, but a network that operates above politics, that maintains influence regardless of electoral outcomes, that coordinates not on policy but on maintaining elite power, is much harder to challenge because it doesn't present itself as a political actor at all. The public watches partisan conflict and believes they're seeing the full range of political possibility. But conspiracy theorists argue that the real action happens elsewhere, in spaces where bonesmen from different parties quietly coordinate to protect shared interests, where the boundaries of acceptable politics are maintained through informal consensus rather than formal agreement, where democracy becomes theatre that conceals oligarchy. Whether this theory is accurate cannot be proven without access to private conversations and private decision-making that remains forever sealed behind the doors of the tomb. But the pattern is undeniable. Skull and Bones produces leaders across the political spectrum, yet those leaders consistently fail to challenge fundamental power structures, consistently maintain relationships across party lines, and consistently prioritise elite consensus over popular demands for change. In this interpretation, American democracy is not fake, but constrained. Elections matter, but within limits. Policy disputes are genuine, but shallow. The public has choices, but only among options that have already been approved by networks they don't control and often don't even know exist. And at the centre of those networks, selecting 15 new members each spring, performing rituals that create bonds transcending politics, maintaining influence that survives every electoral upheaval, sits Skull and Bones, the society that operates above politics, because it understands that controlling who has access to power is more important than controlling what they do with it. Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know and makes a real difference in keeping these stories coming to you. Also, drop a comment letting us know what time it is for you, and where in the world you're listening from, but only if you want to. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It creates this amazing global community of truth seekers and curious minds. Now, let's get into tonight's investigation. There are places on Earth where the official story feels too clean, too rehearsed, like someone scrubbed the details until only the safe parts remained. Mount Shasta is one of those places. Rising over 14,000 feet above Northern California, it dominates the landscape like a frozen sentinel, beautiful and enigmatic. For over a century, stories have circulated about what lies beneath this mountain. Stories of underground cities, stories of ancient civilizations, stories that get dismissed as folklore, New Age fantasy, or the rambling of imaginative hikers who spent too long in thin air. But what if the dismissal is the cover-up? What if something beneath Mount Shasta forced the United States government to seal tunnels, confiscate research, and silence witnesses for nearly 90 years? This is the story of Harold Finnerty, a man who took his secrets to the grave. This is the story of his granddaughter Lila, who refused to let those secrets stay buried. And this is the story of what they found in the mountain. Something that challenges everything we think we know about human history. March 1979. The Deathbed Note. Harold Finnerty died on a grey morning in Ashland, Oregon. Heart failure, the doctor said. Quick and relatively painless for a man in his late 70s. He had lived a quiet life after retiring from the United States Geological Survey, tending a small garden, reading military history and keeping mostly to himself. His neighbours described him as polite but distant, the kind of man who never quite seemed at ease, even in his own home. His granddaughter Lila arrived 3 days after his death to help sort through his belongings. She had always been close to Harold, closer than most grandchildren manage with their grandparents. He had encouraged her curiosity, her questions, her refusal to accept simple answers to complex problems. As a child, she had asked him why the sky was blue, and instead of giving her the standard explanation, he had taught her about wavelengths and atmospheric scattering. That was Harold. He never dumbed things down. The house smelled of old books and pipe tobacco. Leela moved through the room slowly, feeling the weight of absence in every corner. Harold's desk sat near the window, covered in papers and notebooks. She began sorting them into piles: financial documents, personal letters, old survey maps from his USGS days. It was methodical work, the kind that keeps your hands busy while your mind processes grief. Then she found the envelope. It was tucked inside a locked drawer in the bottom of his desk, beneath a false bottom she only discovered because the drawer seemed too shallow compared to the others. The envelope was thick, made of heavy paper that had yellowed with age. Across the front, in Harold's precise handwriting, were words that made her stop breathing for just a moment. Mount Shasta. Do not open classified. Lila sat back in the chair, holding the envelope up to the light. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Harold had worked on dozens of geological surveys during his career. She'd seen his maps before, his field notes, his careful documentation of rock formations and water tables, but she'd never seen anything marked classified. The USGS did not deal in classified material. They mapped the Earth's surface. They studied earthquakes and volcanoes. They published their findings for other scientists to review. So why would her grandfather have a sealed envelope marked with government classification warnings? She broke the seal. Inside were 3 items. The first was a hand-drawn topographic map of Mount Shasta, rendered with the kind of precision that came from decades of professional cartography. The mountain's familiar silhouette was marked with contour lines, drainage patterns, and geological features. But there was something else. On the eastern side of the mountain, below the tree line, A location was marked with a red X and labelled in small, urgent letters, Addit 7, closed 1934. The second item was a series of photographs, black and white, badly faded. They showed the interior of what looked like a tunnel or cave. The walls appeared smooth, too smooth for natural rock formations. In one photograph, a hand was pressed against the wall for scale. The texture looked almost metallic, reflective in the harsh light of the camera flash. The third item was a handwritten note on a torn piece of paper. The mountain is hollow in the wrong places. They found something in 1934. We sealed it, but it wakes. Lila read the note 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Harold's handwriting, no question. But the words felt wrong, almost panicked. Harold had been a scientist, rational to his core. He did not write about mountains waking or hollow spaces in wrong places. He wrote about basalt layers and glacial movements and tectonic activity. She was still holding the note when she heard the vehicles pull up outside. 2 black SUVs parked in front of Harold's house. 4 men in dark suits emerged, moving with the kind of coordinated efficiency that suggested military or federal training. Lila watched from the window as they approached the front door. No badges visible, no agency identification. Just 4 men who knocked once, firmly, and then waited. She opened the door. "Miss Finnerty?" The man hissed. Front was tall, late 40s, with a face that gave away nothing. "We're here to collect materials related to your grandfather's work with the United States Geological Survey. It's standard procedure when a former employee with security clearance passes away." "Security clearance?" Lila kept her voice steady. "My grandfather was a cartographer. He mapped mountains." Nevertheless, the man's expression did not change. "We need to collect his notebooks, maps, and any documents related to his survey work. It will only take a few minutes." They were inside before she could protest. They moved through Harold's house like they had done this before, opening drawers, checking shelves, moving with practiced efficiency. They took his notebooks. They took his old survey equipment. They took boxes of papers from the garage that Lila had not even opened yet. The tall man noticed her watching. "This is routine, Miss Finnerty. Nothing to be concerned about." "Then why do you need his old maps?" "Government property. Technically, any work he did while employed by the USGS belongs to the federal government. We're just reclaiming what's ours." They were gone in less than 20 minutes. Lila stood in the now ransacked house, feeling like she had just been robbed by her own government. But they had not found the envelope. It was still in her jacket pocket, pressed against her chest like a secret heartbeat. That night she spread the map and photographs across her kitchen table and began to research. If someone wanted Harold's materials badly enough to confiscate them within days of his death, then those materials contained something worth hiding. She was going to find out what. The real history, they tell us, Mount Shasta has always been a mountain wrapped in mystery. For the indigenous Karuk, Shasta and Modoc peoples, it was a sacred place, home to the Great Spirit. White settlers arriving in the mid-1800s found themselves equally drawn to the mountain's imposing presence, and soon stories began circulating about what might lie beneath its snow-covered slopes. The Lemurian legend emerged in the late 1880s. According to the story, survivors of a lost continent called Lemuria, similar to Atlantis, had fled to Mount Shasta and established an underground city called Telos. These tall, white-robed figures would occasionally emerge to purchase supplies in nearby towns, paying with gold nuggets of unusual purity. In August of 1884, the San Francisco Chronicle published an account from a prospector named J.C. Brown, who claimed to have discovered an underground city carved into the mountain, complete with gold shields, hieroglyphs, and mummified remains of beings over 8 feet tall. The story captivated readers, though Brown mysteriously vanished before he could lead an expedition back to the site. By 1904, the legend had solidified with the publication of A Dweller on Two Planets, written by Frederick Spencer Oliver. The book described advanced beings living beneath Shasta, possessing technology far beyond human capability. It became a foundational text for the New Age movement and cemented Mount Shasta's reputation as a centre of mystical activity. But here is what the legends do not tell you. Here is the part that gets buried beneath the folklore and the New Age tourism. The United States Geological Survey began heavily mapping Mount Shasta in 1925. Teams of surveyors spent months in the field, documenting every ridge, every canyon, every geological formation. They returned in 1932 for more detailed work, and then again in 1934. Something happened during that 1934 survey. The official records are sparse, almost deliberately vague. A USGS team led by a geologist named Thomas Eldridge was conducting cave surveys on the eastern face of the mountain when they disappeared for 48 hours. When they finally emerged, their report mentioned disorientation and strange acoustics inside the cavern system. They noted that sounds echoed in ways that seemed impossible given the cave's dimensions, and they experienced unusual equipment malfunctions that they could not explain. The report was filed and then seemingly forgotten, except the surveying tunnels, designated Adit 1 through Adit 9, were all quietly sealed within months. The official reason given was structural instability and risk of collapse. No further surveys were conducted in that region for over 20 years. Then there was the aerial incident of 1945. During post-war mapping missions, United States Army Air Force pilots were conducting photographic surveys of the West Coast. One pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, documented an unusual observation in his flight log. While circling the south face of Mount Shasta, he noted what appeared to be an opening in the rock face that reflected light in a metallic manner. He circled back for a second pass and took additional photographs. The photographs exist. They are part of the official military archive. But the official explanation given was ice reflection, a play of light on glacial formations. The opening Lieutenant Webb documented does not appear on any current geological survey. When Lila Finnerty began researching these incidents, she was not looking for proof of underground cities or lost civilizations. She was looking for an explanation of why her grandfather would have a sealed envelope marked classified, and why federal agents would confiscate his materials within days of his death. What she found instead was a pattern of official interest, official secrecy, and official dismissal that stretched back almost 50 years. Harold Finnerty's shadow surveys. Lila spent 3 weeks in libraries and archives, chasing down references to her grandfather's work. His official employment record with the USGS showed steady, unremarkable service from 1948 through 1976. He had worked on surveys in California, Oregon, and Washington. He had published papers on volcanic geology and tectonic mapping. Everything was normal, documented, and publicly accessible, until she found the gaps. Between 1956 and 1959, Harold's official work record showed him assigned to routine topographic surveys in the Cascade Range. But when Lila requested the specific survey reports from that period, she was told that those documents were not available for public review. When she asked why, she was informed that they had been reclassified by the Department of Defense as part of Cold War security protocols. Why would basic geological surveys be classified for national security reasons? She started searching for anything Harold might have left behind that the federal agents had missed. She checked his house again, more carefully this time, looking for hiding places she might have overlooked. She found them in the garage, tucked inside the hollow leg of an old workbench. More notebooks. These were different from his official USGS field books. The pages were water-stained, the handwriting hurried, almost frantic in places. They were dated between 1956 and 1959, the exact years of the classified surveys. Lila spread them across her table and began reading. The surveys had been ordered by the United States Army Corps of Engineers, not the USGS. Harold had been temporarily assigned to a joint military-civilian team conducting what was officially described as seismic monitoring research. The Cold War was at its height. and the government was deeply concerned about detecting Soviet nuclear tests. Seismic stations were being established throughout the western United States to create an early warning network. But Harold's notes describe something else entirely. Subterranean resonance patterns inconsistent with known cave systems, he wrote on one page. Echoes suggest regular geometric spacing beneath primary cavern. On another page, thermal void pockets at depths that should not support such temperatures, heat source unknown. And then, circled in red ink, not natural. Lila felt something shift in her understanding. Her grandfather had not been mapping the surface of Mount Shasta. He had been mapping what was beneath it, and he had found something that should not exist. She kept reading. References to cyclopean geometry, a term usually reserved for massive ancient stonework like the walls of Mycenae or the temples of Malta. References to metallic signatures in soil samples. References to electromagnetic anomalies that interfered with surveying equipment. One entry from July 1958 was particularly striking. Descended into a DEET 7 with the team. The tunnel extends far beyond the 1934 seal. We broke through yesterday. The corridor beyond is not natural. The walls are too smooth. The angles are too precise. There is a smell like ozone and hot metal. The temperature rises as you descend. At the third junction, we found markings. Not native, not English, not any language we recognise. Lila stopped reading and sat back, her mind racing. Adit 7. The same designation marked on the map Harold had sealed in the envelope. There was more. Clipped to the back of one notebook was a photograph, black and white, badly faded. It showed 3 men standing in front of what looked like a tunnel entrance. The men wore field gear from the 1950s. Behind them, barely visible in the dim light, was a wall that looked too smooth to be natural rock. On the back of the photograph, someone had written 3 names: Harold Finnerty, James Pollock, Thomas Eldridge. Thomas Eldridge, the same name from the 1934 USGS team that disappeared for 48 hours. Lila grabbed her laptop and started searching. Thomas Eldridge had led the 1934 survey. According to newspaper archives, he had gone missing 3 months after returning from Mount Shasta. His body was never found. The official report called it a hiking accident, though no evidence of such an accident was ever documented. All of his maps and field notes had been seized by the Department of the Interior in October 1934. 24 years later, Harold Finnerty was working with a team that included Thomas Eldridge's name on the back of a photograph. Either the man had not died in 1934, or Harold had been studying Eldridge's original work. There was one more item in the notebooks that made Lila's hands tremble as she held it. A letter Harold had written, but apparently never sent, dated June 1952. The tunnels extend far beneath the volcanic shelf. Eldridge was right. The structure is artificial. The metal is older than the strata. I do not know what we have found, but I know it should not be here. I know that every instinct in me says we should seal this and walk away. But they will not stop. They need to know what it is, and I fear what will happen when they find out. Project Shas 2, the Cold War connection. It took Lila another month to find the binder. She discovered it in a storage unit Harold had rented under a false name, a detail she only uncovered because he had kept the key taped under the drawer of an old filing cabinet. The storage unit was in Reading, nearly 2 hours south of where Harold had lived. Inside were boxes of materials that the federal agents had missed, things Harold had clearly hidden away deliberately. The binder was labelled Shas 2, Cold War Seismic Anomaly Study, 1957. This was not folklore. This was not conspiracy theory. This was a real government document stamped with Department of Defense insignia, complete with project codes and authorization signatures. During the 1950s, the United States government genuinely did conduct extensive seismic and geological studies on West Coast volcanoes. The official purpose was monitoring for nuclear tests, creating a network of sensors that could detect underground explosions anywhere on the planet. Mount Shasta, as one of the tallest and most geologically active peaks in the Cascades, was a natural choice for such monitoring. But the Shasta binder contained information that went far beyond seismic monitoring. The first section documented equipment malfunctions in the Shasta region. Magnetometers going haywire, seismographs recording vibrations that did not match any known geological activity, radio interference so severe that teams had to communicate using written notes because their walkie-talkies produced only static. The second section was titled Structural Analysis. Here, the language became more technical and more disturbing. Engineers described finding echo patterns that suggested large hollow spaces deep beneath the mountain, spaces that did not match known cave systems. The geometry was wrong. Natural caves form along fracture lines and water channels, creating irregular organic patterns. The spaces beneath Shasta formed regular geometric shapes. One page was marked with a red stamp, structural echoes unlike caves. Another page, metallic signature below basalt layers, and then, circled in black ink, do not breach. Layer 5, Layer 5. Lila flipped through the binder, looking for any reference to what Layer 5 might be. She found it near the back, in a section marked Recommendations. The language was bureaucratic, carefully neutral, but the message was clear. Further excavation beyond Layer 4 is not recommended. Preliminary analysis suggests that Layer 5 contains the primary anomaly source. Equipment failures increase significantly at depths below 1200 meters. Structural integrity of surrounding rock questionable. Team safety cannot be guaranteed. Translation: they found something deep in the mountain, and they were afraid to dig any deeper. The final item in the binder made Lila question everything she thought she understood about her government's relationship with the truth. It was a transcript, dated March 1971. The header read, Remote Viewing Session, Subject, Anomalous Geological Formation. Location, Northern California. Remote viewing. The CIA program that trained psychics to spy on Soviet installations by projecting their consciousness across space. Lila knew about Project Stargate. It had been declassified in the mid-1990s, revealed to the public as one of the strange artifacts of Cold War paranoia. The program officially began in 1972, but this transcript was dated 1971, a year before Stargate supposedly started. The transcript was formatted like an interview. Handler: please describe what you perceive at the target location. Viewer: 12. I see stone. No, not stone. Metal. It looks like metal, but old. Very old. Covered in stone. Handler: can you describe the shape? Viewer: 12. A chamber. Big. The walls curve up like a dome. There are patterns on the metal. Symbols, maybe. I cannot read them. Handler: where is this chamber located? Viewer: 12. Under snow. A tall mountain. North of Reading. Very deep. It is cold there, but the chamber is warm. There is something in the centre. It glows faintly. Handler: what is in the centre? Viewer: 12. I do not want to look at it. It feels wrong, like it is watching me even though I'm not really there. Handler: please continue. Viewer: 12. A sphere, silver or grey. It sits on a pedestal. The pedestal is not human. The proportions are wrong. Everything about this place feels wrong. Whoever built this was not human. Handler: you're safe. The target cannot harm you. Continue. Viewer: 12. There are handprints on the wall near the entrance, pressed into the metal when it was soft. 5 fingers on the left hand, 6 fingers on the right. They are not human hands. The transcript ended there, stamped with a code. Session terminated. Viewer distress. Lila sat in the storage unit for a long time, holding the transcript in her hands. This was not legend. This was not folklore passed down through generations of New Age believers. This was a classified government document describing something beneath Mount Shasta that should not exist. Her grandfather had been part of the team that found it, and now she needed to find it herself. Finding Adit 7. Lila spent 2 months preparing. She was not a mountaineer, not a splunker, not trained for underground exploration. But she was Harold Finnerty's granddaughter, and she inherited his stubbornness along with his curiosity. She bought equipment, she studied maps, she read everything she could find about the eastern face of Mount Shasta, the McLeod region, the Mud Creek drainage area, and Dilla Canyon. Adit 7 had been sealed in 1934. According to mining records, it was one of 9 exploratory tunnels dug during a brief period when prospectors believed there might be valuable mineral deposits in the volcanic rock. The tunnels had been abandoned when no significant ore was found, and most had collapsed or been deliberately sealed due to safety concerns. But Harold's map showed that Adit 7 went deeper than the official records indicated. Much deeper. Lila drove to Mount Shasta in late October, when the tourist season had ended and the backcountry roads were mostly empty. She parked her truck near the old McLeod logging road and hiked in, carrying 60 pounds of gear on her back. The entrance to Adit 7 was supposed to be at roughly 8,000 feet elevation, hidden in a fold of rock near the tree line. It took her 3 days of searching to find it. The entrance had been buried under a rock slide, probably deliberately. Someone had piled stones across the opening and planted brush to hide it from casual hikers, but erosion had created a small gap at the top, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through if they were determined enough. Lila was determined enough. She wriggled through the gap, her headlamp cutting a narrow beam into the darkness beyond. The air inside was cold and dry, smelling of dust and stone. The tunnel stretched ahead, carved through volcanic rock, the walls rough and irregular. This was consistent with the mining tunnels from the 1930s, hand-drilled and blasted by men looking for gold or silver. She followed the tunnel down, descending into the mountain. After 50 yards, the character of the tunnel changed. The walls became smoother, the angles more precise, the temperature rose slightly enough to notice. After 100 yards, she found the seal. It was a concrete wall, thick and professionally installed, completely blocking the tunnel. Stamped into the concrete was a date, November 1934. This was the official seal, the one placed after Thomas Eldridge's team reported their disorientation and strange experiences. But Harold's notes had said they broke through the seal in 1958. She examined the concrete wall carefully, running her hands over the surface, and then she found it. A crack, barely visible, running from floor to ceiling along the left side. Someone had cut through the concrete and then carefully sealed it again. The newer concrete was slightly different in colour, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. Lila pulled out her tools and began chipping away at the newer section. The concrete was old enough to crumble easily under the impact of a hammer and chisel. It took her 2 hours, but she finally broke through. The tunnel beyond was different. The walls were smooth, almost polished. The rock looked melted rather than carved, like something impossibly hot had bored through the volcanic stone. The floor sloped downward at a steady angle, descending deeper into the mountain. Her headlamp beam reflected strangely off the walls, creating odd patterns of light and shadow. She walked for what felt like an hour, though her watch said only 20 minutes had passed. Time felt wrong down here. Sounds felt wrong too. Her footsteps echoed in ways that made no sense, sometimes loud, sometimes barely audible, as if the tunnel itself was changing its acoustic properties. The temperature continued to rise. By the time she reached the junction, it was uncomfortably warm, like being in a greenhouse on a summer day. She checked her thermometer. 85 degrees. That made no sense. She was deep inside a mountain that had snow on its peaks. It should be near freezing, not warm enough to make her sweat. The junction split into 3 passages. The centre passage was marked with a cairn of stones deliberately placed. Someone before her had marked the way. Harold? Thomas Eldridge? She did not know. She followed the centre passage. The walls here were not stone. They were metal. Smooth grey metal that looked old beyond measure, tarnished but not rusted. She reached out to touch it, and the surface was warm, almost body temperature. Patterns were etched into the metal, repeating geometric designs that looked almost like writing but followed no linguistic structure she recognised. This was what Harold had meant. This was what should not be here. Metal walls inside a volcanic mountain, warm to the touch, covered in symbols that predated any known language. She kept walking, and the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. The chamber beneath the mountain. The chamber was enormous. Lila's headlamp beam could not reach the far wall. The ceiling curved upward into a dome, just like Viewer 12 had described in the remote viewing transcript. The floor was made of the same grey metal, smooth and slightly warm beneath her boots. She pulled out a flashlight, a heavy-duty spotlight she had bought specifically for this expedition, and switched it on. The beam swept across the chamber, revealing its true size. It was easily 200 feet across, maybe more. The metal floor was inscribed with concentric circles, radiating outward from a central pedestal. Lila walked toward the centre, her footsteps echoing strangely in the vast space. The acoustics were wrong, just like the USGS report from 1934 had noted. Some sounds echoed loudly, bouncing off the curved walls. Other sounds were absorbed, deadened, as if the chamber itself was selectively filtering noise. Near the wall she found what the remote viewer had described. Handprints pressed into the metal, fossilised in whatever substance had been soft enough to take an impression before it hardened. The left hand had 5 fingers, the right hand had 6. The proportions were close to human, but not quite right. The fingers were longer, the palm narrower. Whoever had built this place was not human. Or if they were human in a way that predated everything anthropologists thought they knew about human evolution. The pedestal in the centre of the chamber rose about 4 feet from the floor. It was made of the same metal as everything else, but the surface was covered in more intricate patterns, symbols layered upon symbols in a way that suggested deep meaning if only you could read the language. On top of the pedestal sat a sphere. It was roughly the size of a basketball, perfectly smooth, made of metal that looked silver in her flashlight beam. The surface was covered in tiny inscriptions, spiralling around the sphere in lines so fine they were almost invisible. As Lila approached, she felt something shift in the air around her. A vibration, barely perceptible, like standing next to high-voltage power lines. This was the artefact Harold had sketched in his notebooks. This was what the government had sealed behind concrete and bureaucratic silence for nearly 50 years. Near the base of the pedestal, someone had left a metal plaque. The plaque was newer than the chamber, maybe from the 1950s based on the style of the lettering. It read, "Eldridge found the heart. We were never meant to open it." Lila stood there for a long time staring at the sphere. Every instinct told her not to touch it. The warnings in Harold's notes, the government's desperate attempts to seal this place, the plaque left by someone who clearly feared what they had discovered, all of it screamed danger. But she had come this far. She had broken through the seals. She had descended into the mountain. She needed to understand what this thing was. She reached out and touched the sphere. For a moment nothing happened. The metal was warm, warmer than the air around it, and the surface felt slightly rough, like fine sandpaper. Then the inscriptions began to glow. Faint blue light traced the spiral patterns, spreading from where her hand made contact outward, across the entire surface of the sphere. The vibration in the air intensified. Lila pulled her hand back, but the glow continued, growing brighter. The chamber itself seemed to respond, the walls humming with a low frequency that she felt in her chest more than heard with her ears. She checked her thermal reader. The temperature had spiked. The sphere was now registering at over 200 degrees. though it had not felt that hot when she touched it. The floor beneath the pedestal was glowing faintly, lines of light spreading outward along the concentric circles. Something beneath the chamber was waking up. Lila backed away from the pedestal, her heart hammering. This was not an artifact. This was not a relic of a dead civilization. This was a machine, still functional, still powered by something that had survived for thousands of years or longer. She needed to leave. Now. She ran back toward the tunnel entrance, the chamber's glow brightening behind her. The hum became a rhythmic pulse, mechanical and deliberate. Whatever she had activated was not shutting down. If anything, it was building towards something, a cycle that had been interrupted decades ago and was now resuming. Harold's final message. Lila made it back to her truck just as the sun was setting. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. She drove back to town, checked into a motel and collapsed on the bed, exhausted and terrified. That night she could not sleep. She kept hearing the hum from the chamber, that mechanical pulse that felt older than humanity itself. She kept seeing the glow spreading across the sphere, the light tracing patterns that might have been writing, or might have been something else entirely, some form of communication that humans were never meant to understand. She needed to know what Harold had thought about all this. She needed to hear his voice, his reasoning, his conclusions. She went back to the boxes of materials she'd taken from his storage unit and searched through everything one more time. She found the tape recorder buried at the bottom of a box of old survey equipment. It was an old reel-to-reel model from the 1970s, the kind Harold would have used for field notes. A single tape was still loaded on the reels. She pressed play. Harold's voice filled the room, older than she remembered, tired but clear. This is Harold Finnerty, recording on March 8th, 1979. If you are listening to this, it means I am dead, and it means you found what I have hidden. Good. Someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to understand what we found beneath Mount Shasta. In 1958, our team broke through the seal that Eldridge's team had placed in 1934. We descended into the mountain, following tunnels that should not exist, tunnels that were not created by natural geological processes or by human mining equipment. The tunnels led us to a chamber. Inside that chamber we found evidence of a civilization that predates anything in the archaeological record. The metal is older than the rock surrounding it. Carbon dating puts the surrounding basalt at roughly 300,000 years old. The metal cannot be dated using conventional methods, but analysis of the oxidation pattern suggests it is far, far older. Millions of years, perhaps. We found a machine. Not ruins, not artifacts. An active, functional machine built by intelligences we cannot comprehend. When we activated it, we triggered something. Seismographs across Northern California recorded vibrations that did not match any known seismic activity. The vibrations came from beneath Mount Shasta, rhythmic and mechanical, like something vast was coming back to life after sleeping for eons. We sealed it again. We had to. The government ordered us to bury everything we found, to seal the chamber, and never speak of it. They were afraid, not of what the public would think, but of what the machine might do if we continued to interfere with it. But here is what they did not understand. Here is what I did not understand until years later. The machine does not need us to activate it. It wakes on its own. Every few decades, seismographs pick up those same vibrations. They are always attributed to minor earthquakes, tectonic adjustments, volcanic activity. But I know better. The machine beneath Mount Shasta is not from a lost human civilization. It is older, it is alien, and it is waiting. I do not know what it is waiting for. I do not know what it will do when it fully awakens. I only know that we were never meant to find it, and we were certainly never meant to activate it. If you have listened to this tape, if you have found my notes and my maps, please understand the weight of what I am telling you. The truth is not what you think. The mountain is not what you think. And we are not alone in our history. The tape ended with a click, and the room fell silent. Lila sat there for a long time, processing what she had heard. Harold had known. He had known for over 20 years that something was beneath the mountain, something that challenged everything humanity believed about its place in the universe and its timeline on Earth. And now she had activated it again. The cover-up arrives. Lila checked out of the motel the next morning and started driving south. She planned to go to Sacramento, maybe find a journalist or a researcher who would take her evidence seriously. She had photographs. She had Harold's notes. She had the tape recording. Someone needed to know what was beneath Mount Shasta. She made it 20 miles before she noticed the black SUVs. There were 3 of them, travelling in formation, keeping a steady distance behind her. When she sped up, they sped up. When she slowed down, they matched her pace. They were not even trying to hide their presence. Lila pulled off the highway at a rest stop. The SUVs pulled in behind her. 6 men emerged, wearing the same dark suits and expressionless faces she'd seen at Harold's house. The man in front was tall, late 40s, with cold eyes that suggested he had done this many times before. He walked up to her truck window. "Miss Finnerty, we need you to come with us." "Who are you?" "That is not relevant. What is relevant is that you entered a restricted area yesterday. You accessed classified materials. You activated equipment that poses a significant security risk." "I do not know what you're talking about." The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You saw the interior. That means you know too much. We can do this easily, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." Lila looked at the 6 men surrounding her truck. She looked at the empty rest stop, no other vehicles in sight. She looked at the man's cold eyes and understood that she was not going to talk her way out of this. She needed to run. She started the truck, gunned the engine, and drove straight at the man in front of her. He dove aside and she swerved around the SUVs, accelerating back onto the highway. Behind her, the SUVs scrambled to follow. She drove fast, faster than she'd ever driven, weaving through traffic, taking exits at random, trying to lose them in the maze of back roads. But they stayed with her, coordinated and relentless. These were professionals. They had resources she could not match. She remembered the side tunnels. When she had explored Adit 7, she had seen other passages branching off from the main corridor. Some led deeper into the mountain. Some led back toward the surface. If she could get back to the mountain, she could lose them in the tunnels. She turned north, heading back toward Mount Shasta. The SUVs followed. She drove up the old logging road, her truck bouncing over ruts and rocks, pushing the vehicle far beyond what it was designed for. She reached the area near Adit 7 just as the sun was setting. She abandoned the truck and ran into the forest, carrying only a small backpack, with her flashlight and Harold's most important notes. Behind her she heard doors slamming, men shouting, engines revving. They were coming. She made it to the rock slide covering Adit 7 and squeezed through the gap. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness as she ran down the tunnel, descending into the mountain. She heard voices behind her, echoing strangely in the confined space. She ran past the broken seal, past the junction, into the smooth metal corridors that should not exist. The men were still following, but they were slowing down, cautious now. They knew what was down here. They knew it was dangerous. Lila found one of the side passages and ducked into it, switching off her flashlight. She crouched in the darkness, listening. Footsteps echoed past her hiding spot, moving toward the central chamber. Radio static crackled, voices speaking in clipped military jargon. She waited in the darkness for what felt like hours. Eventually the footsteps retreated. The voices faded. She was alone again, deep inside Mount Shasta, surrounded by metal walls that hummed with ancient power. She found another passage that led upward, following the natural slope of the mountain. It took her 3 hours of climbing through narrow tunnels, but eventually she emerged on the northern face of the mountain, miles from where she'd entered. Behind her she heard helicopters. She looked back and saw lights converging on the Adit 7 region. Heavy machinery was being brought in. They were sealing it again, just like they had in 1934 and again in 1958. But this time they were not taking any chances. She heard explosions echoing across the mountain. They were collapsing the tunnels completely. The final revelation. 3 months later, Layla received a small package at a post office box she had rented under a false name. There was no return address. Inside was a fragment of metal, grey and smooth, warm to the touch even though it had been sitting in a cold mail facility. The metal was identical to the walls of the chamber beneath Mount Shasta. Wrapped around the metal was a note written in Harold's handwriting. The machine inside Shasta is not from a lost human civilization. It is older. It is waiting. Do not let them bury the truth again. But this made no sense. Harold had died before Lila ever entered the mountain. He could not have sent this package, unless he had prepared it years ago, setting up some kind of delayed delivery system, unless he had known she would go looking for answers, or unless the note was not from Harold at all. Lila spread out all her remaining evidence on her apartment floor. The photographs, the notes, the tape recording, Harold's maps, the metal fragment. She had spent 3 months in hiding, moving from town to town, afraid that the men in black SUVs would find her again. But they had not come. Maybe they thought the evidence had been destroyed. Maybe they thought she would stay silent out of fear. They were wrong. That night, the mountain rumbled. Local seismographs picked up vibrations centered directly beneath Mount Shasta. The frequency was low, rhythmic, almost mechanical. Geologists attributed it to minor tectonic adjustments. Volcanic activity settling after decades of dormancy. Nothing to be concerned about. But Lila knew better. She had heard that rhythm before, deep in the chamber, when she had touched the sphere and felt something vast wake beneath her feet. The machine was still active. The seals had not stopped it. The explosives had not buried it deeply enough. Whatever was beneath Mount Shasta, whatever Harold and Thomas Eldridge and countless others had found over the decades, it was older than human civilization. It was patient, and it was waking. No earthquake was officially reported that night, even though thousands of people across Northern California felt the tremor. The United States Geological Survey issued no statements. No warnings were given. The incident was not recorded in any official database. But Lila had felt it. She had felt the pulse of something ancient stirring beneath the mountain, counting down to a moment when it would fully awaken. And when that moment came, the government's carefully maintained silence would no longer matter. The truth beneath Mount Shasta would reveal itself, whether humanity was ready for it or not. Some mountains hold secrets in their stone. Some mountains hold mysteries in their caves. But Mount Shasta holds something else entirely. It holds evidence of intelligences that walked this earth long before we did, and it holds machines that still function after millions of years of silence. Harold Finnerty died trying to warn us. Thomas Eldridge vanished trying to understand it. Lila Finnerty risked everything to uncover it. The question is not whether the truth will come out. The question is what will happen when it does. The mountain remembers, the machine remembers, and deep beneath the snow and stone and ancient metal, something is waking, something is waiting, something is counting down the years until it emerges from the darkness and shows humanity just how small and young we really are in the vast timeline of this planet. Mount Shasta stands silent against the sky, beautiful and enigmatic. But if you listen carefully, if you place your hand against the stone and feel for vibrations that should not be there, you might just sense it. The rhythm, the pulse, the heartbeat of something older than human memory. And you might realize, as Harold did, as Lila did, that we were never alone on this earth. We just forgot to look beneath the mountains. Before we begin tonight's journey into one of the most carefully guarded secrets of the modern age, I want to ask for your support. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know and allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the unknown. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes an enormous difference, and we truly appreciate it. And if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing our global community and knowing that someone in Tokyo might be starting their morning while someone in London is drifting off to sleep, all tuning into the same mystery. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider subscribing. It means everything. Tonight's story comes thanks to incredible suggestions from Todd Rockwell, Wild MT, One, Mary Meyer, and Stuart. Thank you all for this. Fascinating topic. Now, let's begin. There are wars that history remembers with clarity. Battles fought over land, ideology, resources. The reasons are documented, debated, and eventually understood. But then there are conflicts that leave behind a different kind of residue. Not answers, but questions. Not closure, but silence. The kind of silence that grows heavier with each passing year, as if the very absence of explanation becomes its own form of evidence. In the early 2000s, the world watched as one such conflict unfolded. Military forces moved across ancient landscapes with precision and speed. Official narratives were provided, accepted by some, questioned by others. But beneath the surface of public discourse, another story began to circulate. Not in mainstream media, but in the whispered conversations of researchers, theorists, and those who claimed access to information that would never see official daylight. The rumour was simple in its claim, yet staggering in its implications. Something had been discovered beneath the sands of the Middle East. Not weapons of mass destruction, not oil reserves or strategic military positions. Something far older. Something that predated modern civilization itself. And according to those who believed, something that powerful nations would do anything to control, contain, or keep hidden from the world. This is the story of the Gate Beneath the Sand. Chapter 1. Ancient Gates in Forgotten Texts. Long before the modern nations of the Middle East drew their borders, long before Islam or Christianity shaped the spiritual landscape of the region, there existed a civilization that would become the foundation of human culture itself. Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the cradle where writing, law, astronomy and agriculture first took root in forms we would recognize today. But the ancient peoples of this region left behind more than practical innovations. They left stories, thousands of clay, tablets, painstakingly inscribed with cuneiform script, describing a world far stranger than the one we think we know. Among these texts are descriptions that have puzzled scholars for over a century. References to gates that were not merely architectural features but portals. Doorways that connected the realm of gods with the realm of humans. In Sumerian mythology, these were known by various names, but always with the same essential quality. They were passages between worlds. The Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, speaks of Tiamat and Marduk, of cosmic battles and the formation of the heavens and earth. But within these grand narratives are smaller, stranger details, descriptions of structures that served as meeting places between divine beings and mortal priests, locations where, according to the texts, gods descended from the heavens to walk among humanity. For traditional archaeology, these stories are mythology, symbolic representations of natural phenomena, theological concepts given narrative form. The gates are metaphors. The descending gods are allegories for the movement of celestial bodies or the changing seasons. But what if interpretation has been backwards all along? The conspiracy theory posits a different approach to these ancient texts. What if the people of Mesopotamia were not creating poetic metaphors, but attempting to describe technology so advanced that their language had no proper words for it? What if the gates they described were actual physical structures, and the beings who used them were not gods in a supernatural sense, but visitors from somewhere else entirely? Consider the precision with which these texts describe certain rituals and procedures, the exact positioning of objects, the specific timing of ceremonies, the elaborate protocols for approaching these sacred sites. Do these read more like religious mysticism or technical instructions translated through the lens of primitive understanding? One tablet, fragment housed in the British Museum, describes a gate of the gods in troubling detail. It speaks of a surface that reflected no light, yet glowed with its own radiance, of symbols arranged in circles that would activate in sequence, of a threshold that, when crossed, would lead not to another room, but to another place entirely. The text warns that only those properly prepared could survive passage through the gate. All others would be consumed. The language is archaic, the grammar fragmented by time and damage to the tablet itself. But the message beneath the ancient words carries an unmistakable weight. This was not metaphor. This was warning. As archaeological understanding of Mesopotamia grew throughout the 20th century, certain patterns became impossible to ignore. Major Sumerian and Babylonian cities were not built randomly across the landscape. They were positioned with mathematical precision, aligned to astronomical phenomena in ways that suggested sophisticated knowledge of celestial mechanics. More intriguing still were the underground chambers discovered beneath several of these sites. Vast spaces carved from solid rock, their walls smooth and featureless, their purposes unclear. Official archaeology labelled them storage facilities, grain silos or religious sanctuaries. But the theories that began to form in alternative research communities suggested something else entirely. These chambers, some argued, were not built to store grain or worship gods. They were built to house something, to contain it, to keep it separate from the world above while preventing its complete destruction. And according to the conspiracy theory that would eventually lead to modern military intervention, at least one of these chambers still held its original occupant. Not a religious idol or ancient treasure, but a functional gate. A doorway that still worked, after thousands of years buried beneath sand and time. The ancient texts had not been myth after all. They had been maintenance logs, operating manuals, historical records of technology that predated human civilization as we understand it. And if such technology existed, if it truly lay buried beneath the cradle of civilization, then certain questions became inevitable. Who built it? When? For what purpose? And most critically, who would control it if it were ever found? Chapter 2. The Land Where Civilization Began. Modern Iraq occupies territory that once held the greatest cities of the ancient world: Ur, Uruk, Babylon, Nineveh. Names that echo through history with a weight that few modern cities can match. This was not merely land that civilization passed through. This was where it began. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers created conditions perfect for agriculture, allowing permanent settlements to form and grow. Writing emerged here, first as simple inventory marks, then evolving into the sophisticated cuneiform script that would record everything from business transactions to epic poetry, mathematics, astronomy, the concept of law codes, the wheel itself, all have roots in this region. But for those investigating the Stargate conspiracy, the significance of Mesopotamia goes beyond its role as civilization's birthplace. The theory suggests this was a chosen location, that the same factors that made it ideal for human civilization made it valuable for something else entirely. The geography itself becomes evidence in this interpretation. A land between rivers situated at the crossroads of three continents, accessible yet defensible. A place where, thousands of years ago, something could be installed, used, and eventually hidden with a reasonable certainty that it would remain undisturbed through the rise and fall of empires. Archaeological records show that major sites in Iraq have been disturbed repeatedly throughout history. Alexander the Great marched through Babylon. Roman expeditions reached Mesopotamia. Islamic scholars of the medieval period showed interest in pre-Islamic ruins. European archaeologists of the 19th and 20th centuries excavated extensively. Yet according to the conspiracy theory, none of these groups found what they were truly looking for. They excavated temples and palaces, recovered tablets and artwork, but the deepest chambers remained sealed, either through ignorance of what lay below or through deliberate misdirection by those who knew the truth. Documents that emerged in the late 20th century, dismissed as forgeries by mainstream academics, suggested that certain sites in Iraq had been marked with warning symbols by ancient civilizations, not to indicate treasure or religious significance, but to warn future generations away. The symbols allegedly indicated locations that should remain undisturbed. One such document, supposedly translated from fragments found in a private collection, describes a site near ancient Uruk. The text warns that beneath the city's foundations lies a gate that must never be opened, that attempting to cross its threshold brings madness and death, that the gate itself hungers for passage and must be kept eternally sealed. Official archaeology has no record of such a document. No museum claims it in their collection. No peer-reviewed journal has published its contents. But in the conspiracy research community, references to this warning appear again and again, always second-hand, always unverifiable, yet oddly consistent in their details. By the late 20th century, Iraq had become a nation increasingly isolated from the Western world. Political tensions, conflicts, sanctions. But even during periods of isolation, certain activities continued beneath official notice. Archaeological surveys conducted by foreign teams under the cover of academic research. Satellite imagery analysed for geometric patterns beneath the sand. Quiet inquiries made about ancient texts held in private collections. Someone was looking for something, and, according to the theory, they eventually found it. The discovery, if it occurred, would have been made quietly. No press releases, no academic papers, just a careful notation in a classified file somewhere, marking coordinates and describing an anomaly, a structure beneath the earth that matched no known construction technique, made of materials that should not exist in that time and place, arranged in a pattern that suggested purpose beyond human architecture. And if such a structure were found, if it matched the descriptions in ancient texts, then certain decisions would need to be made, about disclosure, about control, about what happens when mythology becomes archaeology, and archaeology becomes a national security concern. The land where civilization began was about to become the centre of something much larger than politics or oil. It was about to become ground zero for a question that could redefine human history itself. What was buried beneath the sand, and what would happen if someone tried to use it? Chapter 3. A leader obsessed with the past. Saddam Hussein's fascination with ancient Babylon is a matter of historical record. Unlike many aspects of the Stargate conspiracy theory, this part requires no speculation. The evidence exists in stone, brick, and documented public works. Beginning in the 1980s, Saddam initiated an ambitious reconstruction project at the ancient site of Babylon. Walls were rebuilt, structures were restored, often using modern bricks stamped with his name, alongside those of ancient King Nebuchadnezzar. It was, by all official accounts, an exercise in nationalism. A way of connecting modern Iraq to its glorious past, positioning Saddam as the inheritor of Mesopotamian greatness. But those investigating the deeper conspiracy noted troubling details in how this reconstruction proceeded. Certain areas of the site were rebuilt extensively, while others were left deliberately untouched. Excavations would begin, proceed to a certain depth, then suddenly halt and be filled in again. Foreign archaeologists invited to assist with the project would find themselves barred from specific locations without explanation. One German archaeological team, working at Babylon in the mid-1980s, later reported strange restrictions during their tenure. They were told certain underground chambers were structurally unsafe and off-limits. Yet those same chambers were guarded by military personnel, an unusual precaution for sections deemed merely dangerous due to structural concerns. When the team leader inquired about what might be stored in these restricted areas, his questions were met with a polite but firm suggestion that curiosity had limits in Saddam's Iraq. The official explanation for military presence at archaeological sites was protection against looters. Iraq's ancient heritage had long been vulnerable to theft, with artifacts making their way onto black markets worldwide. But the level of security at certain locations seemed excessive for guarding pottery and tablets. Saddam's personal interest in Babylonian history went beyond public restoration projects. Former members of his inner circle, those who later fled Iraq and spoke to Western intelligence agencies, described private meetings where ancient texts were discussed, not as historical curiosities, but as potential sources of practical knowledge. One account, never fully verified but cited repeatedly in conspiracy literature, describes a meeting in the early 1990s. Saddam allegedly questioned scholars about Sumerian references to gates and thresholds. He wanted to know if these were metaphorical or literal. If literal, he wanted to know if any such structures had been located, and if located, he wanted to know if they could be made operational. The scholars, according to this account, gave cautious answers. They spoke of mythology, of symbolism, of the difficulty of interpreting ancient texts, but Saddam pressed them. He insisted there was reality beneath the mythology. He claimed to have evidence. What evidence? The account does not specify, but in the conspiracy theories framework, the implication is clear. Saddam had found something, or someone had found something and brought it to his attention, and his reconstruction efforts at Babylon were not about national pride, they were about access. Consider the timeline. Reconstruction begins in the early 1980s. By the late 1980s, Saddam's regime was pursuing advanced weapons programs with unusual urgency. Chemical weapons, biological weapons, a nuclear program that attracted international attention and sanctions. Official history frames these as the actions of an aggressive dictator seeking regional dominance. But the conspiracy theory suggests an additional motivation. If Saddam believed he had access to technology beyond conventional weapons, if he thought the gates described in ancient texts were real and functional, then his pursuit of modern weapons might have been a cover, a way to explain his true research interests without revealing what he was actually seeking. By the early 2000s, Saddam's government had become increasingly secretive about archaeological sites. Foreign access was severely limited. Satellite imagery showed unusual activity at locations with no obvious strategic value. Thermal sensors detected underground construction in areas supposedly devoid of modern development. Western intelligence agencies noticed. Reports were filed. Analysts tried to make sense of patterns that did not fit standard military or weapons program indicators. And some of those analysts, working from fragmentary information and ancient mythology taken literally, began to form a theory that would sound insane to outsiders. Saddam Hussein was not just pursuing weapons of mass destruction, he was pursuing something much older, much more dangerous, and if the theory was correct, he might be close to activating it. The question became not whether to intervene, but how to justify intervention based on evidence that could never be made public. Chapter 4: Cold War Experiments That Went Too Far. In the decades following World War II, the United States and Soviet Union engaged in a competition that extended far beyond conventional military might. It was a race for knowledge, for advantage in any domain that might provide an edge. And some of those domains existed in territories science had barely begun to map. The Stargate project is not conspiracy theory. It is documented fact. Beginning in the 1970s and continuing through the 1990s, the United States government funded research into remote viewing, psychic phenomena, and the potential military applications of consciousness itself. The program had various names over its lifetime, but Stargate became the most widely known. The official narrative describes Stargate as an experiment in perception. Could trained individuals gather intelligence about distant locations through mental focus alone? Could consciousness transcend the normal limitations of space and time? The results, according to declassified documents, were mixed. Some sessions produced information that seemed impossibly accurate. Others produced nothing useful. After decades of research and millions in funding, the program was officially terminated, deemed insufficiently reliable for operational use. But this official conclusion, conspiracy theorists argue, represents only the surface of what Stargate actually accomplished. The program's real discoveries, they claim, were classified at levels far beyond what has been publicly released, and those discoveries changed everything. Consider what remote viewing suggested, even in its acknowledged form, that consciousness could, under certain conditions, perceive locations and events separated by vast distances, that the mind was not entirely bound by the physical location of the brain. That information could be accessed through means beyond the conventional senses. If consciousness could perceive across distance, the next logical question was inevitable. Could it project across distance? Could consciousness not merely observe a remote location, but manifest there in some meaningful way? And if consciousness could be projected, could physical matter follow? This is where official history and conspiracy theory diverge completely. The declassified Stargate documents say nothing about attempts at physical projection, but alternative researchers point to gaps in the timeline, to funding that continued even after the program was supposedly shut down, to facilities that remained operational with no official purpose. One persistent theory suggests that Stargate researchers made contact with something during their experiments, not merely viewing distant locations, but perceiving distant intelligences, entities that existed in different spaces, or different times, or different dimensions entirely. And these entities, according to the theory, indicated that physical gateways between locations were possible, not through consciousness alone, but through technology. The researchers allegedly learned that such gateways had existed before, that ancient civilizations had either built them or discovered them, that the gates had been used, then sealed, then lost to history. But if the gates had been real once, they could be found again, and if found, they might be reactivated. This is where the conspiracy theory connects Cold War psychic research to ancient Mesopotamian archaeology. The Stargate program, according to this interpretation, was never just about remote viewing. It was about finding the physical gates that ancient texts described, and once found, understanding how to use them. Documents that occasionally surface on conspiracy forums, always of questionable authenticity, describe experiments that allegedly went wrong, attempts to establish contact through discovered gateways that resulted in equipment failures, personnel disappearing, or worse. Strange effects described in clinical language, localized distortions in time perception, interference with electronic equipment, psychological changes in personnel who approached active gates. One such document, supposedly leaked from a defense contractor, describes a test conducted in the late 1980s. A team attempted to activate a structure discovered during archaeological excavations in a location that is redacted in the document. The activation procedure was based on translations of ancient texts, combined with insights gained through remote viewing sessions. According to this account, the activation succeeded. The gate opened, and something came through. The document describes the next several hours in fragmented, almost panicked language. Personnel unable to communicate with the observation team, equipment, registering readings that made no physical sense, and a presence that was intelligent, hostile, and seemingly capable of affecting reality itself through thought alone. The gate was shut down, the site was sealed. The entire program was allegedly restructured, with new priorities focused not on using the gates, but on ensuring they remained closed. Because whatever was on the other side, humanity was not ready to meet it. Whether such documents are genuine or fabrications created by skilled hoaxers, their existence has shaped the narrative of the Stargate conspiracy. They suggest a progression from Cold War research into consciousness, to the discovery that consciousness could lead to something physical, to the horrifying realization that some doors were sealed for good reason. And they suggest that by the early 2000s, certain agencies within the United States government had very specific knowledge about what was buried in Iraq, knowledge that would make securing those sites a priority above all others. Chapter 5. The Artifact That Could Not Be Moved. According to conspiracy theory, the discovery occurred sometime in the late 1990s. The exact date varies depending on the source, but the details remain remarkably consistent across different accounts. A structure was found beneath layers of sand and stone in southern Iraq, near the ruins of ancient Uruk. The structure was circular, approximately 10 meters in diameter. The material defied easy classification. It appeared metallic, but did not match any known alloy. It showed no signs of corrosion despite presumably being buried for thousands of years. Its surface was covered with symbols arranged in concentric circles, each symbol distinct yet part of a larger pattern. Initial analysis was conducted by a team that supposedly included archaeologists, materials scientists, and intelligence personnel. Their findings raised more questions than answers. The structure was not Sumerian, Babylonian, or from any other known Mesopotamian civilization. Its construction technique was unlike anything in the archaeological record, and most troublingly, it appeared to be functional, not a relic or monument, but a device. Attempts to move the structure failed, not because of its weight, though it was certainly massive, but because it seemed fundamentally anchored to its location. Equipment brought in to extract it would malfunction when brought too close. Cutting tools would lose their edge. Electronic systems would experience interference. It was as if the structure itself resisted removal. This resistance suggested something beyond passive physical properties. The structure, some theorists claimed, was connected to the Earth in ways that could not be severed, perhaps drawing energy from the planet itself, perhaps serving as an anchor point for something that required absolute stability, or perhaps simply designed never to be portable, to remain exactly where it was placed by whoever built it. The symbols covering its surface became the focus of intensive study. They did not match any known ancient language, yet their arrangement suggested meaning. Patterns within patterns, mathematical relationships. Some researchers noted similarities to astronomical configurations, as if the symbols mapped celestial positions from a perspective not available on Earth. One translation attempt, supposedly based on fragments found in classified Sumerian texts, suggested the symbols were not language at all but coordinates, addresses, specific locations in space, or time, or dimensions beyond normal perception. And the arrangement of symbols in circles suggested a selection mechanism, a way to choose a destination. This interpretation transformed the structure from ancient artifact to functional technology. If the symbols were coordinates, then the structure was a gateway, a portal that could be programmed to open to specific locations, and if the translations were accurate, some of those locations were not merely distant but fundamentally alien to human understanding. Attempts to test this theory were conducted according to leaked accounts. Small-scale experiments trying to activate individual symbols. Most resulted in no response, but some produced effects that were carefully documented and immediately classified. Localized temperature changes, electromagnetic pulses, and in one case, a brief visual distortion that observers described as looking into a space that did not follow normal geometric rules. The program conducting these experiments was allegedly placed under strict containment protocols after that visual distortion event. No further activation attempts were authorized. The structure was to be studied, documented, but not used. Its existence was to be kept from both the public and most levels of government, and most critically, it was to be prevented from falling into hostile hands. This last concern became paramount as intelligence agencies tracked Saddam Hussein's interest in Mesopotamian sites. If Saddam knew about the structure, if his own researchers had discovered it, or learned of its location through ancient texts, then he might attempt to access it, or worse, attempt to use it. The problem was straightforward in its complexity. The structure could not be moved. It could not be destroyed without risking catastrophic side effects, as the failed removal attempt suggested it was connected to fundamental properties of its location. But neither could it be left in a nation increasingly hostile to Western interests, governed by a leader whose actions had become erratic and aggressive. The solution, according to the conspiracy theory, was invasion. Not for oil, not for weapons of mass destruction, but to secure control of a site that represented the most significant discovery in human history. A working gateway to elsewhere, buried beneath the cradle of civilization, but such an invasion required justification, public reasoning, a narrative that would satisfy international community and domestic populations, something tangible and threatening. Weapons of mass destruction would serve that purpose. Whether they existed or not was secondary to the real objective. The invasion would happen regardless, The weapons were simply the story told while the real mission unfolded in silence. Chapter 6. The Invasion Revisited. When military operations began in Iraq in 2003, the world watched a conflict explained through the lens of national security and counter-terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, links to terrorist organisations, the need to remove a dangerous dictator from power. These were the reasons provided, debated, accepted or rejected by observers worldwide. But conspiracy theorists studying the invasion noted unusual aspects to the military campaign. Certain locations were secured early and prioritised heavily, despite having no obvious strategic value. Archaeological sites received protection that seemed disproportionate to their role in active combat, and specialised teams, not part of standard military units, were deployed to specific coordinates with missions that were never made public. Consider the speed with which coalition forces moved toward particular sites in southern Iraq. Official military doctrine would suggest securing major cities, infrastructure, and known military installations first. But the actual pattern of advancement prioritised certain ruins, ancient locations with no modern military significance. One such site was near ancient Uruk. Military units established a perimeter around the area within days of the invasion beginning. Civilian access was prohibited. Even embedded journalists travelling with military units to document the war were kept away from this zone. When questions were raised about the heavy security at what appeared to be empty desert, official explanations cited unexploded, ordnance concerns or potential chemical weapon storage. But former military personnel, speaking years later on condition of anonymity, described a different reality. They spoke of specialised equipment being brought to the site, of excavation work conducted under heavy guard, of areas that were off limits even to most military personnel, accessible only to individuals with security clearances far beyond standard combat operations. One account describes a perimeter guard detail assigned to the site for several weeks. The individuals providing this account reported seeing no combat action, no evidence of weapons, nothing that explained why this particular patch of desert required such intense security. What they did see were cargo containers being brought in at night, scientific equipment, and personnel who arrived via unmarked aircraft and went directly into underground structures without interacting with regular military units. These personnel, according to multiple accounts, were not conducting weapons inspections. They were not searching for chemical or biological threats. They were working with something already known to be there, something that required specialists with knowledge far removed from conventional military expertise. Archaeological teams were indeed embedded with military units during the invasion. This was publicly acknowledged, framed as an effort to protect Iraq's cultural heritage from looters and collateral damage. But the scale of this protection raised questions. Museums received guards. Important ruins were cordoned off. Yet hospitals and infrastructure sometimes received less immediate attention. The conspiracy theory suggests a dual purpose for these archaeological protection efforts. On one level, they genuinely sought to prevent looting. Iraq's archaeological treasures had immense historical value. But on another level, they provided cover for securing specific sites that held secrets beyond historical significance. Certain locations were not merely protected but excavated further during and immediately after the initial invasion. Ground-penetrating radar was used to map underground structures. Drilling equipment was brought in to create access shafts. And in at least one case, according to classified reports that later appeared in leaked document collections, a chamber was breached that had been sealed for thousands of years. What was found in that chamber remains disputed even within conspiracy circles. Some theories suggest it was the gate structure itself, finally accessed by those who knew what they were looking for. Others propose it was a related chamber, a control room, or storage facility associated with the gate. But all accounts agree that whatever was found was immediately classified at the highest levels. In the months following the invasion, as the search for weapons of mass destruction yielded nothing, public narrative began to shift. The reasons for war were reassessed, justified on other grounds. But quietly, away from media attention, certain sites in Iraq remained under permanent military control, not because they held weapons, but because they held something that could not be publicly acknowledged. The theory suggests that the invasion of Iraq was, at its core, an archaeological mission disguised as a military campaign, that the stated objectives were manufactured justifications for securing control of sites that might contain functioning ancient technology, and that the soldiers, journalists, and even most government officials were unaware of the real reasons their nation had gone to war. This level of deception would require extraordinary justification. But for those who believed in the existence of ancient gateways, the justification was simple. If such technology existed, if it worked, then controlling it was worth any cost, because whoever controlled the gates controlled access to possibilities beyond human understanding. Chapter 7. The Silence. After. When the weapons of mass destruction were not found, when inspections yielded none of the chemical, biological or nuclear programs that had been declared imminent threats, the narrative shifted. Mistakes were acknowledged. Intelligence had been flawed. Assumptions had been incorrect. The reasons for war were re-examined, debated and judged by history. But in the years that followed, certain facts remained curiously absent from these debates. Discussions about failed intelligence focused on conventional weapons programs. Questions about justifications centered on political decisions and diplomatic failures. What was never discussed publicly were the sites that remained under permanent military control long after major combat operations ended. Archaeological locations in southern Iraq became restricted zones. Officially, this was explained as protection for sites vulnerable to looting in the post-war chaos. Iraq's cultural heritage needed safeguarding. International agreements supported this protection, but the level of security at some locations suggested concerns beyond artifact theft. Journalists who attempted to visit these protected archaeological sites were turned away. Researchers seeking access for legitimate academic purposes found their requests denied or endlessly delayed. The areas were off limits, patrolled by security forces, and monitored with technology far beyond what would be necessary to prevent looting. Former military personnel who served in Iraq during the occupation period occasionally spoke about these restricted zones, though always carefully and often anonymously. They describe locations where even soldiers with significant security clearances were prohibited, where helicopter flights were redirected to avoid airspace over certain coordinates, where asking questions about what was being protected would earn stern warnings about operational security. One account, published in an alternative news forum and never verified, described a conversation between soldiers stationed near one such restricted site. They had been told the area contained unexploded ordnance, but no disposal teams arrived to clear it. Instead, the site remained cordoned off, with security increasing rather than decreasing over time. When one soldier suggested that the ordnance story was false, his companion replied that obviously it was false, but asking what the truth might be was not encouraged. Satellite imagery of these sites, available through commercial services, showed interesting patterns. In some cases, structures were built over archaeological locations, permanent installations that remained operational years after the official end of combat. But the buildings were not typical military facilities. They lacked the characteristics of bases or forward operating posts. They were research installations, positioned over locations of ancient significance. The conspiracy theory interprets this ongoing presence as evidence of continued investigation. The gates, if they existed, were too important to abandon. Research into their function, their origin, their potential applications would have continued regardless of public knowledge about the war's justification. The sites had been secured. The real work could proceed in silence, but along with continued investigation came signs of caution. Multiple accounts reference incidents at these restricted sites, equipment malfunctions, personnel experiencing psychological distress, events that required medical evacuation and subsequent assignment to different units. The pattern suggested something at these locations was not merely being studied, but was actively resisting that study. One leaked medical report, supposedly from a military hospital treating personnel evacuated from restricted archaeological sites, described symptoms consistent with exposure to electromagnetic fields of unusual frequency. But the report also noted psychological effects that did not fit standard radiation exposure models. Patients reported perceiving spaces that should not exist, hearing sounds that recording equipment did not capture, experiencing time differently than their colleagues. These symptoms were officially attributed to stress, environmental factors, or pre-existing conditions. But the pattern of similar reports coming from different restricted sites suggested a common cause. Something present at these locations was affecting human perception in ways that conventional medicine could not explain. As years passed, the restricted sites remained restricted. No dramatic revelations emerged. No disclosure event occurred. The gates, if they existed, remained a secret kept from the public and most government officials. But within certain intelligence and military circles, according to the conspiracy theory, knowledge of what had been found became foundational to strategic planning. Future conflicts in the Middle East would be evaluated not just on conventional strategic grounds, but on their proximity to sites of archaeological significance. Regime stability would be assessed partly on whether governments could be trusted to maintain secrecy about ancient discoveries. And research budgets hidden within Black Program funding would continue to support investigation into technology that officially did not exist. The silence after the invasion was not the silence of failed policy or acknowledged mistakes. It was the silence of successful secrecy. The real objective had been achieved. The sites were secured, the gates were contained, and the world remained unaware that human history had been rewritten in the depths of Iraqi excavations. Chapter 8. What happens when a gate is opened? The theories about what occurred during alleged activation attempts vary in their details, but they share a common thread of catastrophe narrowly avoided. These are not official accounts. They exist only in leaked documents of questionable authenticity, anonymous testimonies, and the speculations of researchers who claim access to insider information. But their consistency across multiple sources suggests either coordinated fabrication or multiple witnesses to the same disturbing events. The earliest activation attempt supposedly occurred in the late 1990s, before the invasion, during an operation conducted by Iraqi researchers under Saddam's direction. According to this account, the team had translated enough of the gate symbols to attempt a basic activation sequence. They had studied the structure, documented its properties, and believed they understood the fundamental principles of its operation. The activation was partial. The gate did not fully open, but something changed. Witnesses described the air around the structure becoming thick, resistant to movement, as if space itself had become viscous. Temperature dropped dramatically. Electronic equipment began displaying impossible readings, measurements that violated known physical laws, and then there was perception of presence. Multiple witnesses, all of whom supposedly underwent extensive debriefing afterward, reported feeling that something was watching them through the partially activated gate, not seeing anything visible, but knowing with absolute certainty that intelligence was on the other side, observing, evaluating. The Iraqi team shut down the activation attempt, but effects persisted for hours afterward. Personnel experienced disorientation, difficulty distinguishing memory from present experience, and in some cases, knowledge of information they should not possess. One researcher allegedly began speaking in Sumerian, a language he had studied but never been fluent in, describing what he called the spaces between spaces before collapsing. The incident was classified at the highest levels of Iraqi government. The team was dispersed. Further activation attempts were postponed indefinitely. But Saddam's interest did not wane. He simply became more cautious, more methodical in his approach. When coalition forces secured the site years later, they allegedly found documentation of that failed attempt, and they found evidence that Saddam had been planning another larger activation experiment, one that would commit far more resources and take far greater risks. The invasion may have prevented that experiment from occurring, but coalition forces conducted their own tests according to the conspiracy theory, more carefully monitored, with better equipment, informed by decades of research into remote viewing and consciousness studies. They wanted to understand what the gates were, where they led, and whether they could be controlled. One leaked account describes an American-led activation attempt shortly after securing the site. The team included physicists, archaeologists, and personnel with experience in the Stargate remote viewing program. They approached the activation with scientific rigour, documenting every step, every measurement, every precaution. The gate responded to their activation sequence, symbols lit with inner radiance. The centre of the circular structure began to shimmer, as if the air itself was being replaced with something else. Instruments recorded massive energy fluctuations from sources that could not be identified. And then the gate opened. What lay beyond was not darkness, and it was not light. Witnesses struggled to describe it even minutes after the event. A space that seemed to extend infinitely in directions that should not exist. Geometry that hurt to perceive, angles that implied dimensions human minds were not equipped to process. And the presence, far stronger than in previous attempts, something vast and ancient, aware and interested. The team maintained the gate open for approximately 3 minutes before shutting it down. In that time, they experienced effects that would be analysed for years afterward. Time dilation, with some team members reporting the 3 minutes felt like hours. Audio recordings capturing sounds that seemed to be words in a language that predated human speech. And most disturbing, the appearance of symbols on equipment that had not been there before, arranged in patterns that matched other ancient sites around the world. 2 members of the activation team required medical attention after the experiment. Both recovered physically, but reported persistent psychological effects. Dreams of the space beyond the gate, sense of being observed, and occasional episodes where they would speak about things they claimed to remember but had never experienced, knowledge from perspectives that were not human. The program was restructured after this incident. Future protocols mandated that gates would not be fully opened. Research would focus on understanding their construction and properties, but not on establishing active connections. The risk was deemed too high. Whatever existed on the other side of the gates, whatever intelligence used them or built them, humanity was not ready for contact. But some researchers allegedly argued for a different approach. They claimed the gates represented humanity's next evolutionary step. That fear of the unknown should not prevent exploration. That closing the gates permanently would be like early humans deciding to never leave their caves because the outside world held dangers. This debate supposedly continues in classified facilities around the world. Should the gates be destroyed, if destruction is even possible? Should they be studied but never used? Or should humanity eventually attempt passage, accepting the risks in pursuit of knowledge beyond current understanding? Meanwhile, the gates themselves remain, silent, sealed, but never quite dormant. Because according to some accounts, once a gate has been opened, even briefly, it never completely closes. A connection has been established, and something on the other side knows we are here. Chapter 9. Why the truth could never be public. Imagine for a moment that the conspiracy theory is true, that functional ancient gateways exist, that they were found in Iraq, that they lead to places beyond human understanding. What would disclosure of such information mean for civilization as we know it? The religious implications alone would be catastrophic. Every major faith tradition includes creation narratives, explanations for humanity's place in the cosmos, frameworks for understanding existence itself. The discovery of ancient technology that predates human civilization would require complete reassessment of these narratives. Were the gates built by gods? Then gods are beings who use technology, suggesting they are not supernatural but simply vastly more advanced. This reduces divine beings to powerful entities, stripping away the transcendent nature that defines faith for billions of people. The theological foundations of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, and countless other traditions would require fundamental reinterpretation. Or were the gates built by ancient human civilizations that possessed technology beyond what we consider possible for their era? This suggests history, as we know it is incomplete or incorrect. That civilization has risen and fallen multiple times. That humanity may have achieved technological advancement in the deep past, then lost it through catastrophe or collapse. This challenges archaeological consensus, anthropological understanding, and our entire conception of human development. Or were the gates built by non-human intelligence? This possibility opens questions that would dominate discourse for generations. Are we alone in the universe? Have we been visited before? Are we being watched? Does our civilization exist under observation or even guidance from forces we don't acknowledge? The psychological and societal effects of such revelation would be immeasurable. Beyond religious and philosophical disruption, there are practical concerns. Nations compete for resources and strategic advantage. If gateways exist that allow travel to other locations, other times, or other dimensions, they represent power beyond any conventional weapon or technology. Control of such gateways would become the central focus of geopolitical conflict. Consider what one nation could do with exclusive access to a functioning gate. If the gates connect to other points in space, instantaneous travel becomes possible, rendering borders meaningless. If they connect to other times, the implications for causality and history itself become nightmarish. If they connect to other dimensions where physics operates differently, access to energy sources or materials beyond Earth's limitations becomes reality. The nation controlling such technology would have ultimate strategic advantage. All others would become subordinate by default. The balance of power that has prevented major conflict through mutual deterrence would collapse. Cooperation would give way to desperate competition. Peace would become impossible. This is why secrecy becomes necessary in the conspiracy theory framework. Not to control humanity or suppress knowledge for power's sake, but because disclosure would guarantee catastrophe. The truth about the gates would trigger religious war, geopolitical conflict, and societal breakdown. Better to keep the secret, even at the cost of lying to populations, than to risk the collapse of civilization. But secrecy on this scale requires extraordinary coordination. Intelligence agencies must cooperate across national boundaries. Political leaders must be either informed and complicit, or kept ignorant and managed. Scientific research must be directed away from questions that might independently discover evidence of the gates. Archaeological sites must be controlled. Leaks must be contained or discredited. This level of conspiracy should be impossible to maintain. 2. Many people would need to be involved. Someone would talk, evidence would emerge, the truth would surface. And yet, according to believers in the theory, the conspiracy persists precisely because it must. Because the alternative to successful secrecy is chaos. There is precedent for governments keeping secrets from their populations. Nuclear weapons programs were developed in total secrecy. Intelligence operations remain classified for decades. Technologies are developed and deployed without public knowledge. If secrets about weapons and operations can be kept, why not secrets about ancient gateways? The counter-argument is scale. Weapons programs involve thousands of people, but they are confined to specific locations and time periods. The gate conspiracy would require coordination across generations, across nations, across decades of potential leaks and independent discoveries. The probability of maintaining such secrecy approaches zero, unless the secret is protected not just by classification, but by the fact that revealing it would destroy the revealer as well. If disclosure triggers societal collapse, then everyone who knows the truth has personal investment in keeping it hidden. Military personnel protect it, because their families live in the civilization that would be destroyed. Politicians protect it because their power depends on governmental stability. Scientists protect it because their institutions require functional society. The conspiracy becomes self-maintaining, not through threats or control, but through shared understanding that some knowledge is too dangerous for general awareness, that humanity as a whole is not ready for certain truths, that protecting the secret, even through deception, is an act of care rather than malice. This is the darkest aspect of the theory. Not that powerful institutions conspire against populations, but that they might be right to do so, that the truth really could destroy us, that ignorance, in this one case, might be preferable to knowledge. The gates remain sealed, the sites remain guarded, the truth remains classified, and the world continues in ignorance, perhaps because ignorance is the only way forward. Epilogue. The gate remains somewhere beneath the sands of the Middle East. If the conspiracy theory is true, lies a structure that predates recorded history. Circular. Silent. covered in symbols that describe destinations human minds can barely conceive. It has been buried for thousands of years. It has been found, studied, activated briefly, and sealed again. Military personnel stand guard above it, rotating through assignments they don't fully understand. Scientists occasionally arrive to conduct measurements, document properties, attempt to answer questions that grow more complex with each investigation. Politicians in distant capitals receive classified briefings about its existence, and periodically debate what should be done about it, but mostly it waits. The gate does not corrode. It shows no signs of age beyond the layers of earth that accumulated above it through millennia. Whatever power source it uses, if it uses one, does not diminish. It remains as functional as the day it was built, ready to activate if the proper sequence is entered, ready to open pathways that should not exist. And according to some theories, it is not alone. References in ancient texts suggest multiple gates, placed at significant locations around the world. If one exists in Iraq, others might lie beneath sites in Egypt, Peru, Cambodia, anywhere ancient civilizations describe doorways to the heavens or connections between worlds. Perhaps all gates lead to the same place. Perhaps each opens to a different destination. Perhaps they form a network, an ancient transportation system built by and for beings who saw Earth as just one location among infinite possibilities. If so, finding one gate means nothing. The network exists, the pathways remain. The question is not whether the gates are real, but whether humanity will ever be ready to use them. Some argue we never will be. That the gates should be destroyed if possible, sealed forever if destruction proves impossible. That whatever lies beyond them is too dangerous for contact. That humanity should develop naturally, without shortcuts through ancient technology we don't understand. Others argue that the gates represent humanity's future, that refusing to use them is like refusing to explore oceans or space. That fear should not prevent investigation, that whatever dangers exist beyond the gates, meeting them is inevitable. Better to do so knowingly, prepared, than to be surprised when something from the other side decides to use the gates in reverse. The debate continues in classified meetings, in secure facilities, among the few who know the truth. No consensus emerges, no clear path forward presents itself, and so the gates remain as they have been, studied but unused, guarded but unexplained, secret but persistent. Occasionally there are incidents, equipment malfunctions, personnel report unusual experiences, measurements detect fluctuations that suggest the gates remain subtly active even when sealed, as if whatever exists on the other side occasionally tests the barrier, checking whether the passage remains closed, waiting for the day when humans finally decide to open it permanently. That day may never come. Humanity might exist for thousands of years more without ever activating the gates, maintaining eternal quarantine of technology we found but did not create. Civilization could rise to heights beyond current imagination without ever stepping through doorways left by our predecessors. Or that day might come tomorrow, a shift in policy, a breakthrough in understanding, an incident that forces the issue. The gates would open, humanity would step through, and whatever exists on the other side would finally meet the latest civilization to discover what has been waiting beneath the sand all along. The gate remains, silent, patient, ready. And somewhere, classified in files that few will ever read, are procedures for what happens if it ever opens again. Protocols for first contact, evacuation plans for nearby populations, authorization chains for weapons that might be used against whatever emerges. Humanity has found the gate, but remains uncertain whether that discovery was fortune or tragedy. Time will tell, or perhaps it won't. Perhaps the secret will persist through generations, through centuries, through the rise and fall of nations. Perhaps the gates will outlast humanity itself, waiting beneath the sand for the next species to excavate ancient sites and discover technology they cannot comprehend. But for now, in this moment, the gate exists, known to a few, studied by specialists, guarded by those who follow orders without full understanding, and above it, the world continues. Wars are fought for resources and ideology. Civilizations rise and interact and sometimes collapse. History moves forward, while beneath the sand the gate waits, just as it has waited for thousands of years, just as it may wait for thousands more, unless we decide to open it, unless we decide we're ready for whatever lies beyond, unless we decide that some doors, once found, demand to be opened regardless of consequence. The choice, according to the conspiracy theory, has already been made. The gate was found. The question now is not whether humanity will use it, but when, and what will happen when we finally do.